Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
The internet is full of half-truths and all-out lies. We've all seen them, and many people on social media complaining about it. Here's your chance to show and prove. WorldAfropedia.com is a black-owned and operated encyclopedia. There are several thousand articles, but we need help. We can't uncover all the truth ourselves. So please, join us and become a writer, editor, or blogger for WorldAfropedia.com today. Every little bit counts. We owe it to the future generations to put the truth out there. Visit WorldAfropedia.com, the African-centered encyclopedia, a global database of African knowledge for the purpose of bringing about global African wisdom and understanding. WorldAfropedia.com.
Now, it doesn't matter now. It really doesn't matter what happens now. I left Atlanta this morning, and as we got started on the plane, there were 6 of us. The pilot said over the public address system, "We are sorry for the delay, but we have Dr. Martin Luther King on the plane, and to be sure that all of the bags were checked, and to be sure that nothing would be wrong on the plane, we had to check out everything carefully, and we've had the plane protected and guarded all night." And then I got into Memphis, and some began to say the threats, or talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers? Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Context of White Supremacy. Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, May 5th, 2017. So I have been told this is our 6th study session on the late Mrs. Coretta Scott King, her autobiography, My Life, My Love, My Legacy, as told to the Reverend Dr. Barbara Reynolds. We are picking up in the text right after the assassination of Dr. King. We're kind of in the early portion of chapter 16, where she says, "As I sorted out the 5-year to-do list that would carry me through 1968, that's what we're picking up at in chapter 16. She'll give a lot of information as we proceed, how she's dealing with the assassination. I think we heard some of this last week. The mental health toll that this was taking on both she and her children. Now having to take care of all of their offspring without her husband. Really important, I think, to pay attention. Also to pay attention to how white people are treating her following the assassination of Dr. King. I think a lot of times whites, they can be really sneaky and come in, oh, we had so much respect for him and we marched with him and we love you and we want to support. Let's see if that element plays out in the text as well. Without further ado, we will go ahead and get started. Really enjoying the text. Hope folks are learning a lot. This is Context of White Supremacy. My Life, My Love, My Legacy, the autobiography of Coretta Scott King, audio segment number 1.
As I sorted out the 5-year to-do list that would carry me through 1968 and into the mid-1970s, I realized that my priorities would shift from time to time. However, I believed my immediate concerns had to include continuing my campaign against the Vietnam War and fighting for livable wages and better conditions for workers, the cause Martin gave his life for in Memphis. I had long been a vocal opponent of the Vietnam War, and Martin had made many enemies when he came forward in April 1967 at Riverside Church in New York City to oppose that war. Much of the black clergy, and especially many white Americans, thought he had overstepped the bounds of his civil rights mandates that day. But in the aftermath of Martin's death, I gained another perspective that further fueled my opposition to the Vietnam War, and not just to that war, but to all future military conflicts. First of all, the war generated a climate of violence that too easily poisoned our national life and sickened our national character. Night after night, the horrors of war, such as the napalming of innocent civilians, were brought into our living rooms through the national news. Children saw other children horribly killed. The frequency of war, the grossness of its horrors, and the instant communication of them are among the elements that pepper our culture with violence and create an insensitivity to it. If we, as a culture, become numb to the sight of bombers destroying the inhabitants of whole villages and towns, then surely it becomes psychologically easier for a small group or an individual to plan the assassination of one man. With me, assassinations are not some vague, general topic of discussion. They are the reason I do not have a husband. I do not regard the murder of my husband, of John Kennedy or of Robert Kennedy, as aberrations or random acts by deranged individuals. They were political acts, in both motivation and consequence. Is it a mere coincidence that, shortly before their deaths, these eminent public figures were seeking social progress and fighting particularly to end racial inequality and war? If we face the ugly truths that bigotry has not only been abrasive to the black man and dealt a false sense of superiority and entitlement to the white man, but has also generated a spirit of violence that has deformed the internal compass of our whole society, we will begin to understand how those significant forces of violence have shaped us all. To lose great men to assassination and young men and women to the unnecessary violence of war is intolerable. It is a terrible scar on our national character that will continue to haunt us in uncivil, corrupt ways for centuries to come unless we dare to change. These thoughts fueled my resolve to continue speaking out against the Vietnam War. On April 27, 1968, less than a month after Martin's death, I agreed to play a major role in a rally in New York City by the Spring Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam, a national coalition of anti-war activists. I marched with protesters around Central Park, and then I addressed their gathering. This is what I shared. My dear friends of peace and freedom, I come to New York today with a strong feeling that my dearly beloved husband, who was snatched suddenly from our midst slightly more than 3 weeks ago now, would have wanted me to be present today. Though my heart is heavy with grief from having suffered an irreparable personal loss, my faith in the redemptive will of God is stronger today than ever before. I would like to share with you some notes taken from my husband's pockets upon his death. He carried these scraps of paper upon which he scribbled notes for his many speeches. Perhaps they were his early thoughts for the message he was to give you today. I'm sure he would have developed and delivered them in his usual eloquent and inspired fashion. I simply read them to you as he recorded them, and I quote, 10 Commandments on Vietnam. Number 1. Thou shalt not believe in a military victory. Number 2. Thou shalt not believe in a political victory. Number 3. Thou shalt not believe that they, the Vietnamese, love us. 4. Thou shalt not believe that the Saigon government has the support of the people. 5. Thou shalt not believe that the majority of the South Vietnamese look upon the Viet Cong as terrorists. 6. Thou shalt not believe the figures of killed enemies or killed Americans. 7. Thou shalt not believe that the generals know best. 8. Thou shalt not believe that the enemy's victory means communism. 9. Thou shalt not believe that the world supports the United States. 10. Thou shalt not kill. These are Martin Luther King's 10 Commandments on Vietnam. You who have worked with and loved my husband so much, you who have kept alive the burning issue of war in the American conscience, you who will not be deluded by talk of peace, but who press on in the knowledge that the work of peacemaking must continue until the last gun is silent. In this speech, I went on to address the women in the audience directly. The woman power in this nation can be the power which makes us whole and heals this rotten community now so shattered by war and poverty and racism. I have great faith in the power of women who will dedicate themselves wholeheartedly to the task of remaking our society. With this determination, with this faith, we will be able to create new homes, new communities, new cities, and a new nation. Yes, a new world, which we desperately need. After the spring mobilization rally, I delivered a similar message in June 1968 when I became the first woman to deliver a Class Day address at Harvard University. In that address, I continued my opposition to the war and called for an end to our aerial bombing of North Vietnam. Those were the first speeches I gave after my husband's death, and on the subject of the war, I would continue to seek many opportunities and work countless hours to help our nation and our communities choose peace, not violence. One such effort took place in February 1969. I attended a conference held by a group of clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam at the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., a church famous for its activism. Frederick Douglass had spoken there, and so had my husband. After the conference, I led a delegation to the White House for a meeting with Henry Kissinger, who was then serving as National Security Advisor to President Nixon. The Reverend William Sloane Coffin, chaplain of Yale University, accompanied me. We presented Kissinger with a proposal to grant amnesty to those who had been imprisoned for refusing to accept deployment to Vietnam, as well as those who had fled to Canada to escape the draft. Not much came of that meeting. 8 years passed before President Carter offered unconditional amnesty to those who had refused to be conscripted into military service during Vietnam. So I was taken by surprise by an encounter I had with Henry Kissinger in the mid-1980s during the Reagan-Bush administration. After a get-acquainted visit to Vice President George H.W. Bush, I came out of the meeting to find former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger waiting to see me. We chatted briefly, and he reminded me of our 1969 meeting. I was impressed that he remembered, especially since I had been in his company several times since, and we had made only polite conversation. He said, "Mrs. King, you know something? You all were right, and we were wrong about Vietnam." To hear him say that, after all those years, was quite remarkable. Back in the late 1960s, I not only spoke out against the war, but also sent a clear message that I would always continue to fight for the rights of the poor. In May 1968, I turned my attention to the Poor People's March, which Martin had envisioned as a nonviolent protest focusing on broad economic issues, as opposed to the racial issues we had campaigned against in the past. On May 2nd, I advanced the cause of the Poor People's March from the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, the very site where my husband had been killed a month earlier. Standing there, I began to relive that awful moment, but I pushed those thoughts away, fighting to keep my focus off myself. After all, I was there doing what Martin would have done. I was furthering the dream. The more I thought about this, the stronger I felt. The more I encouraged the crowd, the more I came alive. As I stood there, I felt a strange sense of camaraderie flowing between the protesters and me. Our hopes and aspirations had spontaneously connected in some way. Perhaps it was then that I truly understood I could heal as I pressed on. I could not wait until I felt better to heal. I just had to run on and let the healing catch up with me. A few weeks later, I led the Mother's Day parade beside Ethel Kennedy, the wife of Senator Bobby Kennedy, an event that brought together more than 5,000 welfare mothers to march in Washington, D.C. We highlighted the plight of poor women and children, showing how, from rural Appalachia to the urban ghettos, children were going to bed hungry, their mothers unable to afford decent medical care. Ethel and I immediately forged a relationship, one that was not just superficial but heartfelt. I could never have imagined that only a month after she and I marched together, we would find ourselves sharing another bond, the assassination of our husbands. In the wee hours of the morning on June 5th, 1968, I received word that presidential candidate Bobby Kennedy had been shot as he walked through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. As soon as I learned of the shooting, I got on the first available plane to California, where I joined Ethel at Good Samaritan Hospital. Bobby had a devastating head wound, and although we were hoping for the best, it was almost certain he would not survive. I checked into a hotel with my friend Bernita Bennett and waited. It was such a horrible feeling, waiting for someone to die. I'd never had that experience before. I passed the time praying and preparing a statement, and then, at about 4 a.m. on June 6th, I received the call telling me that Bobby had died 2 hours earlier. I readied myself to fly back to New York with Ethel and some more of the Kennedy family. In New York, I checked into the Waldorf, where I stayed to attend the funeral. After the services, we went by train to Arlington Cemetery for the interment. There, the press caught up with me to tell me that the man alleged to have killed Martin, James Earl Ray, had been caught. They asked me to comment, but I did not. I was at Arlington to pay my respects to the Kennedy family, not to become the center of attention. It was such a tragic time. First JFK, then Martin, and now Bobby. The hate in America kept piling up and striking down our nation's best and brightest. It was so demoralizing. Black people had lost their great hero when Martin died. Now white people, the liberals and the idealists, had lost their great hero too. In a profound way, all of us had lost. Bobby, Ethel, Jackie, and other members of the Kennedy family had been by my side at Martin's funeral. And now, just a few months later, we were joined again in a ritual that seemed never-ending. After the service, to change the sad tone, Rose Kennedy and I talked about motherhood, recalling that she had raised 10 children, I asked her what her secret for good parenting was. "You train the older ones, and they will help you with the others," she said, smiling. After Bobby's funeral, I was drenched in sadness, but it was a consolation to get right back to work, fighting for the causes that were important to him and to Martin. After the Mother's Day parade, I started receiving calls from various women's organizations that, I believe, saw me as a symbol for women. They wanted me to convene and head a coalition of women's groups across various religions and ethnicities whose collective membership topped 100,000. I was certainly in solidarity with their request. I felt deeply that women were the conscience of the family, and we could be the conscience of the nation, too. We were more attuned to protecting the life we had brought into the world. Indeed, I felt we were co-workers with God in His creative activity. In the past, I had wanted Martin to organize a woman's auxiliary in the SCLC. Although he was less chauvinistic than most men in the movement, he failed to do so. Unfortunately, I didn't see myself playing such a leadership role with these groups. I prayed about it, but I didn't feel I had the resources needed to bring this important element together as a whole. And I didn't feel women were really ready to unite and unify. I was still waiting for God to call me and guide me to what I was to do. There were only so many hours in the day, and I had 4 young children at home. I had to carefully determine where I would focus my efforts. So I turned down these requests from women's organizations, though I knew I would always be not only supportive but also proactive in helping women with good causes reach their goals. One cause close to Martin's heart, one I chose to make my own, was fighting for workers. Martin was one of the best friends the labor movement had ever had. In fact, he gave his life in Memphis fighting for better wages and working conditions for striking sanitation workers. In 1962, he had also joined workers on a picket line in a local 1199 drive to organize New York City's independent hospitals, and he called on New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller and urged him to support collective bargaining. In 1969, I went to Baltimore to help local healthcare workers, many of whom were African-American women and single mothers like me. I felt that lending my influence and support and encouraging them to join up with Local 1199, the Service Employees International Union, would help them win a better life. My help with Local 1199 went beyond making a speech. I walked the picket lines outside Johns Hopkins Hospital on Monument Street. Unfortunately, the news stories gave me much more credit than I deserved, claiming that the decisive moment in the drive came when I stood outside the hospital and met with the workers who were unsure about the possibility of organizing against one of the city's largest and most powerful institutions. Even today, the union's official history states, when the aides and orderlies of Hopkins showed up to work on that August day and saw Martin Luther King's widow standing strong outside the hospital, they took heart. The hospital officials quickly recognized the union and negotiated substantial pay and benefit improvements. While the fight was won, it was not the result of one person's actions. It was won by hundreds of emboldened nurses, aides, porters, and orderlies. On the heels of their victory, I agreed to serve as honorary chairperson of the 1199's National Organizing Committee. In that capacity, I spearheaded the invitation for other groups to join us in unionizing South Carolina hospitals and went to South Carolina myself to help organize striking hospital workers. I led marches and rallies. I worked to inspire the strikers to continue fighting for their rights and the rights of their children to lead better lives. Our initiative established the first unionized hospital workers in Charleston. For more than 15 years, I worked with 1199 in major cities such as Philadelphia and New York, remaining a close friend and ally and speaking at its conventions and Black History programs whenever I could. I became a stalwart supporter of other unions since unions and civil rights went hand in hand. They helped fund our causes, we helped them organize their workers. Over the years, I spoke for hundreds of labor groups such as the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers, the United Furniture Workers, the United Food and Commercial Workers, the Industrial Workers of the World, and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. I worked with both the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers. I testified for them when they had important legislation before Congress, such as the Senate Labor Committee's deliberations on behalf of full employment. Through my union activities, I began to understand the power and ministry of presence. Sometimes we win just by showing up. Harry Belafonte helped me understand this quality, too. One day he and I were sitting in a conference room in Chicago waiting to discuss the founding of the Congressional Black Caucus with Representative John Conyers and Arthur Lerone Bennett, Jr. Harry gave me an intense look and said, "Coretta, I don't know what your public plans are, but you have more power just sitting in a room than most people. You don't even have to say much. It's your presence that carries so much weight." When he told me this, I was embarrassed. It crossed my mind that maybe this was a nice way of warning me not to make too many waves around male leaders so as not to deflate their egos. Still, I took to heart what Harry was saying. I thought about the many occasions when I had shown up in all kinds of places representing so many causes. This was the ministry of presence. Of course, I also understood that when I showed up, the news media would tag me as Martin's widow. How well I understood the power of my husband's name and what he represented. But sometimes I wondered how and when people would look beyond the name and see me as a woman of substance and commitment, working for the cause each day of her life. Regardless of this concern, I tried to bring whatever I could that added impact, life, and hope to the great causes that were helpful to humanity. Though Martin was gone physically, I became acutely aware of how much he remained a part of me spiritually. When we were married, our hearts and minds were joined together. As he always said, I was only a heartbeat away from him. We did not have his and hers mission. We were one soul, one goal, one love, one dream. The movement had become embedded in my DNA. It was not something I could choose or refuse. I knew what I had to do. All that was in me had to focus on keeping the dream alive. Something had a hold on me. Something kept me believing I could not let go. I came to believe that it was my calling, my purpose in life, to help institutionalize and internationalize the movement and Martin's work. I felt that serving as Martin's partner in the struggle had readied me to continue climbing up toward that mountaintop, toward that ideal that Martin had seen but could not reach. Most of Martin's closest aides went on to other agendas and jobs, as would be expected. But I understood clearly that other than raising my children, I had just one goal. The legacy had to continue. As Martin's other half and the architect of the King legacy, I could play a crucial role as an agent of change, following dutifully as God ordered my steps. I would go on to champion hundreds of different ones, but my highest public priority had to be giving birth to my fifth child, an institution to celebrate and advance Martin's cause, mission, and legacy. 17. My fifth child. Throughout my life, whenever I didn't pray, things went badly. I would become frustrated and feel out of sync with the will and purpose of God, but whenever my life was guided by prayer, I felt good about what I was doing, and I was able to reach out to other people with love and understanding. In the wake of Martin's death, I pondered and soul-searched, trying to determine my future plans and goals, and of course, I prayed. It was during this time of prayer that the idea of creating an institution dedicated to Martin's legacy arose to the top of my life's to-do list. As John Russwurm, who co-founded the first Black American newspaper Freedom's Journal in 1827, put it, "Who can tell our story better than we ourselves can tell our story?" I knew that if I left our story for others to tell, it would be misinterpreted and maligned. Through 12.5 years of ministry, Martin changed the world we lived in. I wanted to ensure that his legacy to humanity lived on and could be replicated. So, on June 26, 1968, I founded the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Center, and in July, only 3 months after my husband's assassination, I held a press conference announcing it. Eventually, the name was changed to the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, or the King Center. In those hectic first days after Martin was gone, I worked on the center right there in our bedroom. Sometimes I slept with files of Martin's sermons and news clippings neatly stacked alongside me on the bed, on the side of the bed that only months before had belonged to the love of my life. I had conceived the center as an extension of Martin's personality, not just a place, not just a building, but a spirit, one undergirded with his philosophy of nonviolence and love in action. It would be an official living memorial, a place where we could teach his philosophy, methodology, and strategies of nonviolence in the hope of bringing about social change and eliminating what he called the triple evils of society: poverty, racism, and war. The center would advocate not just for civil rights, but for human rights. It would encourage community and economic development in Atlanta, as well as agitate for national political empowerment and promote social and economic justice around the world. I knew that I did not want the center to be a monument set only in bricks and mortar. Yet I did want a physical memorial as well, and I envisioned a state-of-the-art archive of my husband's sermons, speeches, and other pertinent writings, and also films documenting the civil and human rights movements. I saw conference space for programs devoted to issues such as penal reform, voter registration, economic reform, and training in nonviolent conflict reconciliation. And I wanted a Freedom Hall with an auditorium and meeting rooms and an all-faiths international chapel, an administration building, a memorial park, a community center, and an auditorium, and of course, a permanent entombment for Martin. Just as, at its best, the White House is viewed in the United States as the People's House, the King Center and its offshoots would offer a snapshot of what a beloved community in the World House could become. Again, by the beloved community, I am not talking about a utopian dream of a perfect society in which everyone lives together without conflict. Many artists have produced lovely, bucolic renditions of the peaceable kingdom, with lions and lambs lying down together and everyone having his or her own vine and fig tree. This is more like heaven than the beloved community on earth, which is not a perfect society. To me, the beloved community is a realistic vision of an achievable society, one in which problems and conflict exist but are resolved peacefully and without bitterness. In the beloved community, caring and compassion drive political policies that support the worldwide elimination of poverty and hunger and all forms of bigotry and violence. The beloved community is a state of heart and mind, a spirit of hope and goodwill that transcends all boundaries and barriers and embraces all creation. At its core, the beloved community is an engine of reconciliation. This way of living seems a long way from the kind of world we have now, but I do believe it is a goal that can be accomplished through courage and determination and through education and training if enough people are willing to make the necessary commitment. In the early years, My mission called for raising the funds to build the center, to hire staff, implement programs, and build some physical structures. In consultation with my family and a few close friends, who would eventually be put in board positions, I estimated that we needed to raise about $20 million to fulfill this vision. Little did I know that raising the necessary millions would be easy compared to fighting off the gremlins close at hand, who battled me at every stage. The long road to see this initial project to fruition was filled with difficult moments and what I now know were unnecessary setbacks. These challenges were often very painful for me. Of course, a nice way to describe the opposition and obstacles I encountered would be growing pains or labor pangs. But when I experienced the attacks on my attempts to build a center, it felt like backstabbing, plain and simple. For years I have not talked much about this, but now I feel I must speak about this process. The story of the center could be an example for anyone who wants to know the truth about institution building, to grasp the flaws and contradictions that lie within the construction of both a human and a concrete infrastructure. I am a process person. To me, the story of establishing the center includes not just the beginning and the ending, but also what went on in the middle. Throughout the long years, I often wondered if there would someday be an attempt to tell this whole story. Too often the center was a one-liner in some news report that gave a brief and unfair assessment of its accomplishments without any attempt to understand its purpose or any acknowledgement that establishing its essential programs and physical facilities took 14 years of hard work. Early on, the carping and mean-spirited treatment I experienced from some of the SCLC, the organization my husband co-founded, was very difficult. Almost from the start, some of Martin's chief aides fought my building efforts, saying, "Oh, you know, Coretta, she doesn't know what she's talking about, and she's just talking." Or, "There goes Coretta. She's just talking big talk. She can't do that." In 1973, I was maligned publicly by Reverend Hosea Williams, one of my husband's top assistants, a man who was with Martin in Memphis when he was killed. Reverend Williams attacked me in the media, saying that my fundraising efforts for the center were taking money from SCLC and that I should have divided the money I was raising for the center with them. Instead of coming to me and asking for funds, he slammed me in the press. He said I wouldn't give the SCLC any money, which was not true. In 1969, for example, the center had split the proceeds from the screening of the Abbyman documentary From Montgomery to Memphis with the SCLC. Then Ralph Abernathy joined the fray. He told the media that the SCLC was in poor financial shape, a state that would have been avoided if I had headed the fundraising efforts or had split the money I'd raised for the center with the SCLC. I remember Ralph saying, "Now, Mrs. King has the right to found any organization that she chooses, but Martin Luther King Jr. never founded but one organization, and that was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference." In essence, he was saying that there should be only one organization, certainly not mine. It was clear that what the SCLC leadership really wanted was for me to continue raising funds for them, just as I did when Martin was alive. Sometimes Martin would brag about how the SCLC could make payroll only because of the money I'd brought in through freedom concerts. But now I felt a calling to another role. I had to be about my husband's business and about working for the nation that I wished the United States could become. After watching these painful attacks on television, I wanted to get up and call some of the reporters I knew and defend myself. But I've always felt that negative and harsh counterclaims only keep the pot boiling. And I certainly did not want to turn up the flame. I just wanted to be faithful to my commitment to the movement. To this day, I have never understood why Ralph thought I was such a threat to the SCLC. I was simply trying to build an institution that would deal with research, education, and training around my husband's legacy. I never wanted to compete with SCLC in an area where it had done such a great job. Nobody could have done direct action better. But I felt strongly that younger generations had to be educated and trained, and who better to do that than Martin Luther King Jr.? What better than his message? At one point, I recommended that the SCLC and the Center conduct leadership training together. I didn't have people out there who had that expertise, but the SCLC leadership refused. They wouldn't cooperate at all. In those early days after Martin's death, the media seemed to focus a lot of attention on me, and I had the feeling that all that attention made some SCLC people uncomfortable. I was Martin's widow, and the media had a tendency to come to me. That's the way it was. I was on the board of SCLC for some time. After a while, I stopped attending meetings because I was treated with such disrespect. At the root of their problems with me, I think, was that I appeared to them to be a strong woman, not one to be pushed aside. Remember, this was the early 1970s, and these were primarily Baptist preachers with a strong sense of male superiority. Most thought that women should stay in the shadows. However, I felt that as women, we had much to contribute. In fact, for the longest time, way before I married Martin, I had believed that women should allow our essence and presence to shine rather than letting ourselves be buried and shunted to the sidelines. I was brought up in the Southern tradition and was taught to have manners, to be ladylike and polite. That, however, did not mean allowing other people to walk all over me and treat me like a wallflower. It did not mean allowing some struggles men have with women to overwhelm me. I tried to operate in the strength and the grace of the Holy Spirit, and that kept me going. Once I prayed about it and felt I had God's blessing, I never really doubted that I could build a great institution. I knew I could not quit. The naysayers would not stop me. When I didn't know exactly how to begin the venture, I prayed. When I didn't know where to look for funds, I prayed. When critics condemned me without cause, I prayed. And when the physical buildings of the center were completed, I still prayed, thanking God for how far He had brought us and asking Him to continue His watch to protect and guide us as we made our way forward. Also, I remembered that only after death was Martin so loved. While he lived, he was often condemned. Could I really have expected to be treated any differently? I did so wish for Martin during these tough moments. But in my crises, I did not have him to lean on. In my darkest hour, I felt so alone. I never fixated on that for long, though. There was too much to gain. The very fact that Martin was gone gave me a fighting spirit, encouraged me to keep building and developing. With or without the top men in the SCLC, I had to keep building the center. I just believed that I was going the right way, and when I was able to raise the millions of dollars we needed, I saw that as affirmation that I'd done the right thing. When you can raise that kind of money against all odds, well, that in itself is encouraging. And I believe that if I just kept treating the movement men, even my detractors, in a loving way and working for the higher cause of service and of keeping Martin's agenda alive, eventually the barriers would come down. This is precisely what happened. Reverend Ben Hooks, formerly with SCLC, who went on to head the NAACP, came to me and told me what an outstanding job I was doing. For quite a while, he sent checks for $1,000. One of my husband's biographers, Lerone Bennett, complimented me on doing a miraculous job. What I found even more rewarding was the about-face from some of the women around me who had initially spoken against me. They had been taught that a woman was supposed to stay home with the kids. I didn't fit the mold, and they didn't understand what I was doing. When they saw me standing up and speaking out, they seemed to think I was a threat to their way of life. But then, as they watched more closely and saw what I was doing, they began to support us. Also, Far outnumbering the naysayers was a wonderful supportive network of people, including my family and Martin's family. For example, Christine King Farris, Martin's sister, was absolutely dedicated to helping me with the center from its inception, working alongside me daily, as did her husband Isaac Farris Sr. He managed the King Center bookstore and eventually served as the project manager for the construction of the King Center. Daddy King was a strong force who occasionally accompanied me to raise money. Our niece Alveda, one of A.D. and Naomi's daughters, was one of my first secretaries at the center. In the early 1980s, Alveda's mother Naomi worked at the center's bookstore, and in the mid-1990s, she assisted me from my home. My sister Edith provided a lot of administrative support and helped with our initial cultural events. I also had trusted help from people who weren't family in the beginning. Over the years, Pat Lattimore, Dorothy Lockhart, Narissa Neal, Laura Brown, and Halton Horton all helped with the children. Mr. Horton had started working for us when Martin was still alive, mostly as a handyman. After Martin was gone, Mr. Horton also helped as cook and as a surrogate for me at the children's extracurricular activities, and he often drove them to school and to their doctor appointments. Daisy Dial cleaned and cooked for us for years. Bob Fuse and Gordon Joyner tutored the children. So I had the trusted help of family and other people who became like family. When you're building a great institution, someone has to help you take care of your home and your kids. I could never have done what I did without all these people. The King Center started in the basement of our home. After Martin died, I had the basement built out for the purpose of providing King Center offices, a kitchen, and a playroom for the children. Martin's sister, Christine, became my number 2 person, my right arm. She initially oversaw the finances. She came to my home every afternoon after her day of full-time teaching at Spelman College. She'd pick up her kids after school and bring them over to be with my kids. Her kids, Angela and Isaac Jr., did their homework while she worked on the King Center's books. Afterward, we would sit in my bedroom or in the kitchen to talk about the King Center, current affairs, and family matters. Through the years, we talked almost every day, many times late at night by phone. She worked with me this way, a silent giant behind the scenes, for a long time and didn't get the credit she deserves. She was the accountability factor, someone who would keep the books and whom I could trust. I really can't say enough about what a pillar she's been to me or to my family outside the King Center. She's always been there, supporting me in every way. She also kept Bunny sometimes on weekends when I had to go out of town, since Bunny and her daughter Angela were close in age. As a volunteer at the center, she was vice president, treasurer, and chief fiscal officer, eventually becoming senior vice president and ultimately vice chair and treasurer. She used her skills as an educator at Spelman to help write Kingian nonviolence curriculums, such as the Martin Luther King Jr. Infusion Model for Teaching Nonviolent Principles, grades K through 12. She wrote the first intermediate-level textbook on Martin for schools. She was also in charge of the King Center's Early Learning Center, housed at the Community Center, and the Right to Read program, and she chaired the King Ecumenical Service for many years and worked on the committee for the King Center's annual fundraiser, the Salute to Greatness Awards Dinner. In 1970, as plans for the center continued in earnest, I embarked on a global tour to promote My Life with Martin Luther King Jr., a book I'd published the year before. My travels took me to Great Britain, Germany, Holland, France, Spain, Sweden, and Italy, where I carried forth the message of nonviolence and unconditional love, and also hosted freedom concerts to raise funds for the center. While in Amsterdam, I was invited to have lunch with Queen Juliana of the Netherlands, one of the longest-reigning monarchs in the world at that time. A dozen years later, in 1982, when Juliana's daughter Beatrix succeeded her as queen, Queen Beatrix came to the center and gave us a sizable financial contribution. Spain was a country that had lived under a dictatorship for so many years. Yet the message of love and nonviolence I carried with me on that trip in 1970 quickly touched the hearts of those I met, and the people proved to be so loving and embracing. They were perpetually hugging and kissing me. It was just overwhelming. In Italy, crowds lined up to see me. Such love I was finding in these white European countries, love that made for a particularly sharp contrast when I got horrible news from home about more hate. While I was in Italy, someone shot up Martin's crypt in the predominantly black Southview Cemetery in Atlanta. Several bullet holes marred the crypt's surface as if it had been used for target practice. Southview Cemetery was founded in 1886 by 9 former slaves who had been barred from whites-only graveyards and had opened Southview to all races, but through this evil act, the ugly past came racing back. Can you imagine people hating Martin so badly that they would still shoot at him even after he was dead? Following this incident, we quietly moved his grave to the grounds of what would eventually become the Freedom Hall complex at the King Center. In 1973, we broke ground for Martin's permanent entombment, the International Chapel of All Faiths and the Freedom Walkway. For a time, after that 1970 trip to Europe, the image of 2 distinct and opposite human realities of being loved where I had never been, but subjected to hate where I lived, lingered in my mind. Still, in the face of such upsetting developments, I remained ever energized, seeing through the building of the King Center with the start of the King Library and Archives, the hiring of staff, the revitalization of Martin's birthplace, and the location of temporary administrative offices. Then in 1978, all my dreams for the center came much closer to reality when Henry Ford II took on the task of heading an $8.4 million building campaign for the center's Freedom Hall complex, which included an auditorium and meeting rooms, the administration, programs, and archive building with an exhibit hall. Also in 1978, we received about $3.5 million through our friend, President Jimmy Carter, who hosted one of the major fundraisers for the center. I never expressly asked President Carter for the money, but several times he publicly credited the King family for helping get him elected. In fact, he repeatedly said that if it were not for Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. and his movement, which changed the culture of the South, he would never have made it to the White House. His administration, working with Coca-Cola executives, paved the way for us to apply for several funding sources. Yes, we had to apply for funds like everyone else, but I feel sure we were shown deference because of our relationship with President Carter. Hundreds of major corporations and unions also contributed. Taken together, the funds we raised provided the money we needed to build the center, and by the time we completed construction, in the early 1980s, we had paid it off. That in itself was a miracle. I pushed for all construction to have 50% minority participation, and in the end, we exceeded that benchmark with more than 60% participation. We were so proud of that accomplishment. To me, this set an example of how affirmative action and job creation can be a plus rather than something to fight about. I always believed that we had a unique opportunity among other African American families to continue the democratization of America. So we had to press to get the most equitable results out of whatever we did.
Context of White Supremacy. That will wrap for the first audio segment. We are still in chapter 17. There's like a break, so we'll come back, and the first sentence says, beyond establishing the physical site, I had to build the right team to staff and run the center. That's what we'll be picking up at, but we are still in chapter 17, a considerable portion of reading remaining. Again, this is the autobiography of Mrs. Coretta Scott King, My Life, My Love, My Legacy. If you have commentary you would like to share, the number to dial, 641-715-3640. The code 564943 pound. Press *6 if you would like to participate. Number again, 641-715-3640. The code 564943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. If you do not want to use your phone to dial in, you can use the free VOPE line. It is linked at Black Talk Radio Network. If you need the address, tiny, TINY.cc/1 race, and that is the number 1. Address again, tiny, TINY.cc/1 race, and that is the number 1. When you put in that address, look on the left of the page. You'll see the link for the free VOPE line. Click it. It will open a small window on your screen. The top line, it's a drop-down menu. Select the number I just gave out, which again is 641-715-3640. The code, next line, again, 564943. Final line, it will ask for a name. You can put in a real name, a nickname. You can press random keys. Once you get all that information entered, click the green button at the bottom. It will connect you to the live broadcast. You should be able to hear the broadcast. If you would like to participate, it is the same procedure. You'll see the dial pad on your screen. Press star 6. When you do so, you'll hear an audio prompt. Press the number 1. I will get your hand. You'll be able to share your views. With that, folks who dialed in, if you have commentary you'd like to share the first audio segment from this week, feel free to chime in. Folks who have a hand up, line should be open.
Yes, may I be heard?
Yes, sir, Mr. Demery Ford.
Okay, greetings, guys. Greetings to the other callers and listeners. Try to be brief. Last week I was saying that, her reactions after her husband's murder did not seem normal. But now, after hearing, her speak further, they had talked about his death and she had prepared herself. And then she did mention that the feeling of separation was overwhelming, and the enormity of stepping into her husband's shoes, carrying on his dream, had to be, quite the mission. I heard mention of Bernard Lee. He was personal assistant, Dr. Martin Luther King. I think he may have been even closer than Ralph Abernathy, and he stayed loyal to the end. The London trip, where she was preaching in this cathedral, the different European countries she visited where the white people were falling all over her. We know that white people can be very nice, but at the same time, the ultimate goal is the oppression and the continued maintenance of white supremacy. Rose Kennedy, when she was talking to her, Rose mentioned she had raised 10 children, and Mrs. King asked her the secret to raising children, and she said, training the older ones, and they'll help you, with the other ones. Sounds eerie, similar to Willie Lynch's letter to plantation owners. The Center for the MLK Center as a living memorial, worthy task that she took on. She talked about the evils of society, the triple evils of society: racism, poverty, and war. You can sum all three of them up by concentrating on racism, white supremacy, which effectively causes the other two. Human rights is a more accurate term than civil rights because it falls under, civil rights falls under. And quickly, it looks like money trumps civil activism. Whites are very skilled at causing rifts and distracting non-whites from uniting against racism, white supremacy. And the main scourge on our society is racism, white supremacy. And one last thing, whites shooting at Dr. King's crypt, the 3 T's, it's just terroristic, trifling, and I'll leave it there. She mentioned the beloved community, which I need some further clarification on that. I'll mute my line, Gus. Thanks for taking the call.
That is hilarious. Further clarification, indeed. That the shooting at the casket, that's pretty common. They've done similar acts. Racists. You can add another T in there. Typical. They did similar acts with the casket of Emmett Till and Fred Hampton. Lots of black people, even black people who weren't trying to do anything to fight against racism, white supremacy, have been subjected to similar fates. Other folks who have a hand up that we have not heard from, if you have commentary, feel free. I heard retired firefighter, and I think female caller. Maybe we'll get the female caller first.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for taking my call, and I'll try to be quick. This is a female caller from Ohio. I definitely appreciate this book because I feel like I was not taught anything about Mrs. King in school other than the fact that she was married to MLK. I did feel like the part where she was talking about the assassination of her husband and also I think it was JFK. I thought that she seemed less confused, especially, and I guess I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the book in front of me, how she said if a country can plan a war, then killing one man basically wouldn't be that hard to do. So I definitely can appreciate that she didn't just feel like it was just that one man, that one angry white man that would just kill her husband. Another thing, I did appreciate how she did read the notes, like the commandments about I think it was the Vietnam War, and the one about how the world really doesn't love or believe in the United States. I felt that Dr. King, it seemed like he didn't seem as confused as if like so many, I guess what I was taught, I'm assuming the other people were taught about how the United States is supposed to be the greatest country in the world. So I felt like he seemed like he had a moment of clarity. And just some points from last week, because I had gone back and listened to the archives, I did agree with the male caller who felt that who had issues with the comment from Jackie Kennedy to Mrs. King, basically about how she spoke so well or she talked so well or something like that. I definitely felt like that was extremely tacky, especially since Mrs. King just lost her husband, and to be judging her on the fact of her language that she used. And to the question that she had asked, I guess it was a few weeks back, about how a female callers would feel about females not being able to participate or speak at the March on Washington. I did also agree with MA, and I felt that it's just the confusion that initially would make me feel like, well, that would seem wrong for females to not be able to speak at the march, but then also I feel like that's just because of the confusion that whites have put us through, and I feel that the men they're also confused as well, feeling that women would not further help the cause. So it's definitely not something that I blame the men, of course, BGQ. That's all I had to share for the first segment. Thank you. Oh, and I'm sorry, lastly, I do appreciate the fact that she did add in the part about the Dr. King's tombstone or gravesite being shot up. That's not something that I was aware of as well. That's all. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Retired firefighter. I think he might have hit his mute button. Are you still with us, retired firefighter?
Greetings, everyone. I thought I had took myself off mute, but I didn't. Greetings, everyone. I'm probably not going. It's probably going to be too long. I took a lot of notes, but here goes. Just stop me anytime you feel like it. The speeches that she was making on the Vietnam War, I have down here that gives me further evidence that even she was still under the surveillance of the I'm not going to say the FBI, I'll just say the forces of white supremacy that she was under the surveillance of, had to be during that time, whether it was Johnson, especially under Richard Nixon. Do not trust white people when all of a sudden they start telling some truth. I'm talking about Henry Kissinger, who, and by that time, 68, 69, the place that we know as Vietnam there were probably millions of Vietnamese people who were dead by that time. That the foliage in that part of the world is still dead to bombardment and Agent Orange during that time. So there was a lot of destruction during that time, and then all of a sudden he mentions this truth. And Henry Kissinger certainly was someone that non-white people cannot hold and trust. I noticed that when she mentions the quote-unquote martyrs, she didn't mention Malcolm X. She also didn't mention the head of the NAACP, who was assassinated, the Mississippi chapter head of the NAACP. I just can't think of it. Medgar Evers. She didn't mention his name at all. She mentioned her husband's name with these white males exclusively. Most of us seek validation. Because I'm not pointing a finger at Mrs. King. That's why I have here on the next thing. Most of us seek validation from white people, if we are honest. And the white people who have power and seeking validation from them, it's almost irresistible not to seek validations from powerful white people. I have here, I guess later in the book, she would form a relationship with Betty Shabazz, because prior to, so far, all of the people that she formed a relationship with, based on they had similar circumstances, were white females. I wrote that down after she mentioned about her meetings with and sitting with Mr. Robert Kennedy's wife. But I think for sure that she did form a relationship with Betty Shabazz, and hopefully she was mentioned in the book. I have that. I cringe every time I hear the word legacy. Every time I hear that word, nothing against Dr. King or his wife or any other non-white person who are victims of racist white supremacy. If anything, we better have as a legacy, it better be the continued attempts to counter racism, as opposed to personalities. I have noticed in my short time on this planet that slows down the process. The last time I went to the center, it seems to be crumbling. I don't know if it's publicly or privately funded. I've been there twice. And it seems to be. I think there were articles on it, on that very subject, if I'm not mistaken. I have here, I guess, when Mrs. King was in part of this reading, she was talking about quote unquote utopian ideas, and I guess that was her description of justice, and I apply to that VGQ. The Montgomery to Memphis documentary that she mentioned is a great documentary. If anybody hasn't seen it yet, you probably can see it on YouTube. But it's a great documentary. I have here also a lack of counter-racist codification is evidence with the SCLC. This is the reason why you cannot organize white supremacy away. With the fussing and fighting over money, over funding, that sort of thing. It's unfortunately, it's atypical when we, instead of united independent, we go and rally around a quote-unquote organization as opposed to codification. I'm near the end. I find it refined on how white people can exploit the death of a black person and parade his widow around the world to pretend that they are serious about replacing white supremacy with justice. In other words, there's nothing that I know of that would be able to fund Mrs. King or all of these places. That's a lot of money. So I'm pretty sure it came from a whole lot of very wealthy and powerful white people to get her all over the world and to speak. Just the three T's again. And last but not least, powerful white people will easily deliver resources for this defeat if they are helping you. If they are helping you, be suspicious of white people. If they're helping you at your task, and that's all I have to say. Thank you. I made it. Thank you.
That documentary, Montgomery to Memphis, is on Netflix for people out there who have it. You can check it out. They remastered it. I guess this was released some time ago, so they have updated it and looks all great. I think you can probably get it at the public library. Check it out online. I've seen some versions there. Netflix probably got a lot of options if you want to check it out. Looks like it's got some good archival material. Is anybody else that we missed? Anybody else who has a hand up that we have not heard from at all?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
All right, greetings, Gus, and greetings to other callers and listeners. I'll make it real quick. I was on the road listening, so I'm doing this off the top of my head. She's very media savvy with in regards to when she was paying respects to, I guess, when Bobby Kennedy's memorial, they were trying to bait her about, they found the assassin of her husband, and she didn't basically take the bait on that. And also, too, that kind of ties in with my second comment about the SCLC being, I guess, saying things about her in regards to raising funds for the center. And I give her much black self-respect for that because, she mentioned that she was prompted to pick up the phone and lash out against them, but she had enough black self-respect to say, no, that's, it's not right, and it's probably something that white people, would want her to do, just like when they were trying to get her to go against her husband in those claims of his infidelities. Also, too, she mentioned about how the Martin Luther King Center was shortened to the King Center, white people kind of love to shorten names out for some reason or another. When you talk about the FBI building, they say J. Edgar Hoover building. So it's like they say his full name, but you got one name for the King Center. And also too, when she talked about the idea of doing this, she mentioned an institution. So kind of puzzled on that. It went from being the idea became an institution to a center. So I was kind of puzzled on that. That's all I had, and I'll mute my line.
Right on. Any other folks who have a hand up that we've not heard from? If you have commentary, did we miss anybody? Okay, I will assume we got folks for now. If you are listening, other folks, if you have comments that you want to get in before we get to the second audio segment, please do not wait till the last minute. Go ahead and get your hand up if you have commentary. I think someone did actually write in. I'll make sure I add their written commentary also. Some of the notes that I took from this week. Let's see. I guess when she frames her, I don't know what you call these, her commandments, I guess, for the Vietnam War, 10 commandments for the Vietnam War. I just thought that was interesting. It seems like, or it doesn't seem, the evidence, it seems pretty flagrant to me, her commitment to the Christian faith and how much that influences how she views white people, how she views the world, how she views, what she should be doing in terms of counter-racism. I just thought that was an interesting framework to present these 10 commandments when it seems that even many of the people who allege that they are Christians do not follow the commandments as they're written in the Bible. We wouldn't have a problem with racism if people were following those commandments to begin with. When she mentions attending the conference for the clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam, this is in 1969, at the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church. That is where Dr. Frances Cress Welsing had her memorial service, not her memorial service, when last year after she transitioned. And I think Gwen Eiffel may have had a homegoing service as well when she transitioned right at the end of 2016. I have to double check, but I think that is correct. The commentary about Bobby Kennedy, I think we talked about them before. Some of you all mentioned it. I thought, and even before I get to all of that, COINTELPRO, it should not be minimized. Bobby Kennedy, when he was Attorney General, when his brother was president, he authorized J. Edgar Hoover and the COINTELPRO wiretaps surveillance of the King family. That was something that I put in the description to have, because last week she talked about how Bobby Kennedy got extra phone lines. He was running for president at the time. He got extra phone lines for the King household after Dr. King was assassinated, because they were getting such a volume of phone calls to have someone who has authorized you being illegally wiretapped providing extra phones for you. Just the irony should not be lost. But anyway, back to this week. Just this, when she's hanging out with his wife, I think that, at least for me, that's been a major pattern. This opportunities to hang out with white people. When she mentioned, being around whites at Antioch and dating a white guy at Antioch, and then going to all these other places and being around white people who, at least for the moment, appear as though they are not being flagrantly racist towards her or, other non-white people in the vicinity at the time. But I think that's just a part of the confusion. In fact, I can use the word that she used, where she said in the session we read previously that she and Dr. King were naive about what was happening to them, naive just about racism in general. I would say I get that same sense in the way that she's talking about, the Kennedy family. When she talks about going immediately, all of the sympathy and concern, she is a single mom with 4 children who have been threatened in a house that was bombed. She's being threatened. Her deceased husband's casket is being shot at, but she immediately stops to go and grieve with these white people. And it's not an attack of her. I think it just happens in the system of racism, white supremacy, where that is how we have been groomed to function, to empathize, sympathize, relate to whites. And that's something that we really need to break. And I know this was widespread at that time because a lot of black people had that sentiment that Mrs. King is expressing, that, the Kennedys at least seemed like they were okay with the niggers. They seemed way better than all the other white people, and man, they were just the coolest whites we've ever seen until the Clintons came along. A lot of black people in that era had that perception, and I just think it comes down to not having an accurate understanding of what it means to be white. Again, the same thing. I think it was great, Mr. Retired Firefighter, pointing out that it was all these other white people mentioned who were gunned down at the time. And she says, best and brightest. Mr. Fuller says, recommends not using that term brightest to describe people as being intelligent or smart or skilled or whatever it is, because it's kind of a close association with white. But yeah, there were tons of black people who were being shot down every day at this time period. We already mentioned quite a few of them: Medgar Evers and Fred Hampton, Minister Malcolm X. Tons of black people being beaten, and worldwide, Patrice Lumumba being beaten and killed at this time period. And, they are not mentioned. It's consistently been these white people. And I pointed that out before, that she skipped over the four little girls. It was not done chronologically. She skipped over when that church was bombed in September of 1963 to get to the Kennedy assassination. It just seems like a major pattern in the book. And again, that could be, white editors trying to make sure that the book doesn't rankle white readers too much and presents good white people. She's certainly not. You would not get the impression reading this book that all white people are racist and that we are not trying to have cool, great relationships, friendships, maybe even date one or three white people. Yeah, the whole going to the funeral and being drenched and all of that just white identification, that's major. Let's see. I thought when she goes on to her work with John Hopkins, I thought that was phenomenal. Black Self-Respect. It reminded me of Henrietta Lacks, John Hopkins, Baltimore. Reminded me of that and their long history, because I think when we've talked about John Hopkins before, even with medical apartheid, it was kidnapping black people, organ harvesting, Henrietta Lacks doing all kinds of experiments on black people, and even black people who reside in that area being suspicious and having these rumors about things that racists at this facility have done to black people in the area. I had not even thought of black people who work there also being mistreated and abused and not compensated correctly, which is standard operating procedure. But I just thought that was phenomenal. Her lending her name, her time, and energy to go and help these black employees, very much in the spirit of something her husband would have done. I'm sure he was extremely proud of her efforts with that as well. And the hospital officials are reacting quickly, don't want us looking bad with Miss King out here, having us looking like Bull Connor. Met LeVron Bennett Jr. was mentioned. Phenomenal black historian. I think he was one of the publishers for Ebony magazine back at a time when they, in my view, did a lot more content, constructive content, directly addressing racism, white supremacy. He also wrote a splendid biography of Abraham Lincoln, where he makes it clear, unambiguous, that this was a race soldier, someone who had total disregard and contempt for black people. Forced into Glory is the name of it. Phenomenal book, one of my favorites. Maybe something we should read on the program. I thought it was great. She also mentions Representative John Conyers being very helpful with what they were doing. LeVron Bennett Jr., great work. I would highly recommend folks check his scholarship out. Let's see, move in chapter 17, where she's talking about this facility. I don't want to jump ahead because we have a long way to go in the text, so I don't know how much will be covered in the book. I guess the only thing I can say is kind of retired firefighter, as he was saying, Mr. Fuller. His view is that the four-wallism, when you go to get these structures, buildings to fight against racism, a lot of times racists can easily derail the focus to where it started off, let's get this building to help us fight against racism. Now we are, distracted to keeping the building. We're not even focused on using the building to fight against racism. Everything is just devoted to the upkeep, maintenance costs of the building or the space that we have. That whites seem to be very skilled at, distracting and ruining that whole arrangement. Let's see. The rankling over money, great. Folks talked about that. That came up with the March on Washington, where that spilled out into the press, where whites were talking about that as well, where you had different quote-unquote civil rights groups squabbling, bickering with each other over funds. Find the same thing, like with getting the building. I am not surprised, nor should anyone be surprised in any of these sort of efforts. If it ends up being bickering, squabbling about how money is being spent, or if people feel like they're not getting their share of the funds, standard racists are great at exacerbating this, and they're great at being able to swoop in and say, well, hey, we heard you you black people were having some financial trouble. Well, I got a big check. And maybe if we can, get one or two white people on the board, or maybe we can look at some of your points and maybe a few things that I don't particularly like. But, oh, yeah, we can write a big check and get all that taken care of. They are phenomenal. They got a lot of different ways that they can handle that sort of thing. I thought when she brought up some of the, problems that she had with members of SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, again, same thing, the system of racism, white supremacy. That's why I say I'm not with the whole brother and sister thing. You cannot have love, quote unquote, under a system of racism, white supremacy, the squabbles, arguments, all of that. Very, very easy for racists to instigate that sort of thing. I guess something that did come to mind, I have not heard any personal anger or bitterness. Those might not be the best words, but those are the two that came to mind immediately in kind of the way, the tone when she was talking about some of the problems that she had with members of SCLC and comments that they made about her maybe diverting funds away from their organization, or they just, weren't on board with what she was trying to do. Valid, her frustrations, but I have not heard that same tone directed at specific white people, even white people collectively, I would say for the most part. It seems to be very quickly after any incident, when whites shot up the casket of her husband, I didn't hear that type of, bitterness directed at white people collectively. When they burned down her house when she was a child, when they bombed the house when she was there, I can't think of a time where there's been direct bitterness in just what I perceive directed at black SCLC members, directed at white people. And it's not an indictment of Mrs. King, but it is a pattern that I see where consistently victims of racism, where we are allowed, encouraged to be more aggressive, more angry, more upset, more animated in how we deal with our frustrations with other victims of racism. We are much more calm, much more reserved, much more forgiving with racists. And a lot of that is the power differential. I think a lot of us know that if we, look like we're getting too rowdy or too angry with whites, they can put a hurting on us. And again, whites may have had a big hand in editing this book. It seemed also like a lot of white identification, white validation with these trips around the world. I think I've got that sense a few times in the book when she went overseas with the Nobel Peace Prize and some of these other trips, just hobnobbing with these white. She even says in Italy, crowds lined up to see me. Such love I was finding in these white European countries, with an exclamation point, like, oh my goodness, I can't believe it. And again, that's very, very common. You had a lot of black people, black expats, so they were called, James Baldwin and many others, who exited the States at this time period and went abroad, went to France, went to some of these very same locations, France and other places, and said the same thing. Getting away from these crackers in the States, and oh man, these white people over here are great. I'm never coming home. And some of them, they stayed over there and hung out. And again, I would just say all of us, Gus T Renegade, top of the list, we are all very confused, very naive, and all still learning about what racism, white supremacy is, how it works, what it means to be classified as white. The Henry Kissinger thing just kind of stuck at me for a lot of different reasons. I guess it depends on how much you know about him and what your perception of Dr. Henry Kissinger is, someone who won the Nobel Peace Prize, unless I'm mistaken. I suspect he is a high-level race soldier who has been very involved in global white tyranny, terrorism for decades. him coming back to Mrs. King years later and saying, "Oh man, my bad. You were right. We was wrong. That whole Vietnam thing sure was messed up." That doesn't mean a hill of beans to me. Like, okay, do you have some sort of compensation since you were incorrect for all of the disproportionate number of black people who died and were harmed and all that, got addicted to drugs while they were participating in all that, got drafted, black people like Muhammad Ali who got their whole life ruined around the draft, all these non-white people in Vietnam? Do you all have some sort of compensation package for all of the non-white people to correct all of this? And maybe even the white people who orchestrated all this, maybe there should be some criminal charges or something since you were wrong and you're man enough to admit that publicly. Just you can add that with just more tackiness. It's the same type of thing. It reminds me of when white, I'm sorry. We killed your son, John Edwards. He was 15 and we're sorry. Continuing. Is there anything else I wanted to make sure I get in before I double check, make sure we didn't miss anyone? Phenomenal black self-respect. Make sure I get in when she talks about the construction for the site. You can feel however you want to about the King Center, if that's worthwhile or whatever. But her pushing to get construction to have 50% minority participation, quote unquote minority participation, and then to exceed that, I think that is phenomenal. If you are a black person and you're in that sort of position where there's going to be a structure built and you have some say-so about, hey, I'm going to see if I can do everything that I can to see if I can get some black people a job, get them some employment as a result of this, that is phenomenal. I definitely think she deserves some kudos for that. Is there anything else I wanted to make sure that I get in, or am I satisfied? I think I might be good. I will stop there. If we have other folks who have commentary they would like to share, if we missed anybody, you should go ahead. If you have not shared at all, you should go ahead and get your hand up now. If you have commentary, if we got everybody. Other folks, did you have additional comments you wanted to make before we move forward? Everyone satisfied? Nothing additional they needed to make sure they got in? I'll assume folks are good. I did, and just in case, because it could be sometimes people have different perceptions about things, people that either have a hand up now or people that are listening in terms of my view. You feel free. That was not my perception. That's you could just make it as clear as that. That was not my reading. That she was not being particularly frustrated or bitter with her treatment from black SCLC members when she was trying to get the King Center set up. She didn't sound frustrated or bitter, or even if she did, she has sounded, she has had a similar tone with the way that she has talked about white people in the book. If there are folks out there, if you have that view, if you didn't think there was any noticeable difference in the way she articulated her frustrations about the way that they mistreated her, and juxtaposed to the way that she's talked about how whites have abused she and her entire family for generations throughout the book, including killing her husband. Did folks have any commentary on that?
Repeat yourself, Gus.
My view, I said, was that it just seemed very different, the way that she articulated her frustration with the black SCLC members, the tone that she took, where they were saying, accusing her of, stealing funds from them or not splitting the money with them or whatever. They just didn't like her as a black female doing this. The frustration that she shared in the book with how she was treated by these particular SCLC members, as opposed to the tone, the frustration that she shows, or lack thereof, when she talks about how white people practice racism against she and all other black people. Do you all see a difference, or does she sound the same? Because I'm saying it sounds very different. She sounded frustrated and angry, bitter, in a manner talking about the SCLC members in a way that she did not sound when talking about whites consistently in the book. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think you're right on point, and it's a mistake that most of us make for various reasons, because of it takes a lot of self-respect, discipline to keep the focus on white people. I guess primarily because white people also are very keen on when to show up in your face and when to not be around, for one thing. Whereas non-white black people are we're around each other too much, and I'm talking about consciously around each other too much, and just sitting around in a lot of cases. And I'm speaking about myself, sitting around, not really doing anything at all, but just sitting around one another, just to be sitting around. And we have to get out of that and spend some time by ourselves. It's nothing unhealthy to sometimes have some self introspection, and be by yourself to just think. And then we would kind of like, I would say, probably would have a lot less negativity in our minds about each other, and we definitely it would raise up and be replaced by having that type of negative understanding with white people, because they deserve it. It's a long history of that. So I think you're right on it. I understand similar to what you're talking about.
The person. I just wanted to grab. I think we had one person who hadn't shared at all. The caller at 2812, last four digits 2812. Did you have commentary?
Yeah. Good evening. Yeah, I just wanted to speak. I called in earlier, but I had to hang up, so that's why I didn't comment on the first thing. I think your comments are dead on, Gus, and I think I mentioned this on like the second call, is that I'm a PK, preacher's kid, and it's a badge of honor. What I've been noticing about racism, white supremacy, but particularly in the quote-unquote black church, it's a badge of honor to say that you've been mistreated and you've gotten through it. And basically that is exactly what Miss King says when she's commenting, because she does not allude to who's doing the mistreating, ever. Maybe on subtle occasions, and that's VGQ for her, tremendous black self-respect, but she literally just sounds like my mother and other victims over the years, and I just think that racists have done a wonderful job in almost convincing us that the only way for us to get justice is to continue to get mistreated. And that's where I think all of it is coming from. And that's just my opinion. I agree with you. I could be wrong. But it just seems like the lack of bitterness, and it's not just for her, it's for a lot of people. I mean, I would almost say that racism, white supremacy, and the reason why I mention church is because my parents and a lot of my family members, when they speak, they sound exactly like her, similar age brackets, even a little bit younger. But I just believe that Miss King and a lot of people from that particular movement, they raised a generation of black professionals and people that grew up in this era to where they knew the damage that white people could do. They knew exactly what they did, and they almost didn't want it to happen again, and it was almost forbidden to speak directly to say racism, white supremacy, because you knew that you're not going to get as much love as firefighters as from whites. They're not going to parade you around. They're not going to showcase you. They're going to, treat you like other blacks that have spoken honestly about racism, white supremacy, and those people have gotten hurt. So I just think it's not being honest, and as victims, we do that a lot. But I just think that it's become a badge of honor to get almost mistreated in this system, and that's how a lot of people, particularly in the quote-unquote black church, and it sounds like not just the black church, but its victims, that's what we talk about. So sorry, I didn't want to ramble, but that's just how I felt. Appreciate it.
No apologies needed. Appreciate that. Mr. Demery Ford, did you have commentary?
Yes. I don't have the book in front of me, but after she had talked about traveling to Europe and how she was received and all of that, and then she said that when she started to put the center together, she said that hate had come back, like it had went away at some time. And then when she spoke about them desecrate or giving her a hard time of, informing that center, I believe she called them gremlins. Or it was some adjective she was using. I was listening, but I don't have the book. I think she used some term. So you're right on in what you said. I'll mute my line.
She did say gremlins. I had a curious look at that as well. I can give the exact sentence. This is from chapter 17, where she says, in the early years, my mission called for raising the funds to build the center, to hire staff, implement programs, and build some physical structures in consultation with my family and a few close friends who would eventually be put in board positions. I estimated that we needed to raise about $20 million to fulfill this vision. Little did I know that raising the necessary millions would be easy compared to fighting off the gremlins close at hand who battled me at every stage. Unless all the gremlins were the no-good black people at the SCLC, I would think some of these gremlins would have to be white people. And from what I know about this, in fact, if you want to read another book that touches on this and is just a great read in general, Gil Scott-Heron, he has an autobiography that kind of talks about his own childhood and growing up, going to New York, how he got into music. But the main thrust of the book is how he worked to get a federal holiday for Dr. King and things that he was also doing to help and why he thought this was important to do. So it kind of weaves in. And I'm sure that some of the quote-unquote gremlins who come up who were staunchly, and I'm sure some of that's got to come up in this book. I'll just leave that there. But yes, I do think that pattern, taking it easy on white people, we'll leave it at that. Anything else folks want to make sure that they add before we get to the second audio segment?
Have you heard?
Yes, ma'am.
I did also want to agree with you guys. I do feel like you said, I don't think it's too, you're being too hard on Mrs. King. I'm not, admonishing her or anything like that as well. I do feel like other people have said, just the overwhelmingly influence of Christianity. I think that's definitely that definitely controls a lot of her moods and also her reactions towards the blatant racism and the subtle racism that she encountered from whites. That's all I have. Thank you.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, I thought it was curious as well. The little portion right after when she says she's lamenting this period where all these assassinations are taking place, and she says that white people were losing their heroes too. Like, it just seems like there's very much a strong sentiment that there are good white people and we should be concerned about white people. We're all in this together. Whites are going to be a part of the beloved community as well. And it seemed like that was, pretty close to what she lived, what I consistently have heard from her and her husband, Dr. King. I can see why racists would promote that and get a lot of mileage out of that, because we got a group of whites that are dedicated, particularly if it's what does it mean to be white? What does that classification mean? And if that means all of us in some way, shape, or form are committing ourselves to dominating, abusing every single individual on this planet in the known universe we classify as not white, I could see how that would be very beneficial to promote something that just is not accurate about what racism is not accurate about what white people represent, and is potentially putting you in harm's way, encouraging you to, be loving and sympathetic with enemies. Folks satisfied? Anything else they need to make sure we get in before we move to the second audio segment?
Can I be heard?
Heard both of you? Go ahead, sir. The caller who asked the question that you could be heard. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. Just quickly, I do agree with you on the issue with her being more strenuous with the SCLC than with white people. Probably, one of the things is that even in the past events of the book, she's had kind of a strenuous relationship with the SCLC when Dr. King had got his Nobel Peace Prize. How, she mentioned how Ralph Abernathy was not happy
Oh, are you still with us, sir?
Oh, hello. Sorry,
Yes, sir.
I hit my mute button by accident. All right. But just like with, just like now and just like back then, COINTELPRO probably was infiltrating the SCLC, just like they did with other black organizations, and probably causing a lot of confusion amongst the members. So I would probably say that probably contributes to that as well. But I'm pretty sure that's probably not going to be mentioned in the book much, but I'm just going to assume that was the case. So that's all I had.
Was that Mr. Demery Ford? Did you speak up also?
No, that was 2812, Gus. I had two quick questions, and I think I answered one of them. The fifth child, I'm assuming that was a metaphor?
Correct.
That she was speaking? Okay. And then I think someone else had mentioned this. Is the King Center still under any family leadership, or it's all corporate now? Is anybody familiar with that, or does anybody know?
I'm kind of I don't know even what to say, because I don't know how much of that is going to be covered in the book, if at all.
Okay.
I'm not really sure, because I do know some of that information. They had, major financial, not surprisingly, major financial difficulties sometime within the last, I think, 5 to 10 years. And I mean, like, major, like it was, is this going to continue to exist? How is it going to move forward? Blah, blah, blah. Like, very detailed, very whole messy thing involving disputes about what was happening there. I don't know if that's going to come up in the book or not. If it does not, then I guess we can add that as we go. And if other people, I'm sure there are folks who are way more informed about all that than myself. If you want to add anything, feel free. I just don't know if this is going to come up later in the book or not. Anyone want to add anything on that, or folks can do their own research? I know it is massive. I don't know if people that are listening have been to the King Center. I have been. I lived in Atlanta, so I've been multiple times. But it is a big center, so I'm sure it costs quite a bit for the maintenance and upkeep and just everything about it. I know they still, I checked the calendar, and they have events that are happening right now, so they still have good quality work going on. And I am certainly appreciative. When I first moved to Atlanta, they had the Without Sanctuary exhibit on display at the King Center. That's the book. It's a photographic history of lynchings in the U.S. Lots of great material. It's a book, but they also have a traveling exhibit with the book as well. And that was there like literally the day that I moved to Atlanta, it was there. So I was able to check that out. That was great. And they've had a lot of similar types of events. I thought that was constructive. Similar events that are also constructive. We did have a person write in. I will read their comment, and then I did see another caller. One of the people that wrote in, and if listeners, if you listen to the archive and you just want to write your commentary in, we can read. We're about halfway through the book, so we should have more time to share. But this caller, she writes, on the question of non-white females not being able to play a more prominent role in the civil rights movement, for me it comes down to the matter of understanding the system of racism, white supremacy. Not that I have a complete understanding. Mrs. King stated that both her and Dr. King were naive, as I am pretty sure the other so-called leaders were as naive about the system of racism. Hence, not taking the white man racist suspect who followed Dr. King as a threat. It reminded me of how Dylan Storm Roof was allowed into the prayer meeting and the prayer group being slaughtered. Remember, she's talking about earlier in the book when Dr. King, he was walking into a building, a white man followed him and eventually hit him really, really hard. He had headaches and what have you after that incident. She continues, even after all the trauma and abuse that Dr. and Mrs. King and those non-white people around them endured, they could not come to terms with the depravity of racist man, racist woman, and racist child, and seemed to always be on the lookout for that good white person. If I remember correctly, most of the non-white males in charge were in one form or another Christians. Pastors, ministers, churchgoers, even if they weren't, I could be incorrect in this, but a lot of prayer may have taken place in households just to get through and deal with the terrorism they faced. Having the Christian faith, the Bible talks of men being the head of the household and women coming under their rule. Again, not understanding white supremacy and the fact that, as Mr. Fuller states, we are all on the slave ship together and none of us are in charge of anything, let alone each other. The non-white males believed, and I think to this day, that they can and should conduct themselves as a white man in the handling of his so-called woman. So it's not surprising that the leaders of the movement would delude themselves into believing that they could use patriarchy in their arrangements with their female counterparts, forgetting that both non-white males and females were the targets of terrorism. One of our female callers who's been listening and writing commentary as we've been moving along. The caller from a blocked number, did you have commentary you wanted to share? You should be with us also.
Can I be heard?
You are low. If you could speak up, that would be great.
Catch me on the other side, Gus. I'm not sure how to work this just yet. I'll experiment a little more.
Oh,
okay.
You're good now. If you could just keep that level right there, you're good.
So my point was going to be regarding her discussion about the when she tried to make the analysis of the Vietnam War, and she talked about violence and connecting the dots. I think her understanding of violence at home and abroad, that she better understands how, quote, violence shapes us all, unquote, because her husband was fighting for justice and he was murdered for it, and it was violent. And war abroad is violence, and it's something that we're all exposed to, not only as black people, adults and children, and how that informs us about violence, whether it's abroad or at home, and that it informs us in that it causes us to understand that violence can be used against us in the same way that it's used abroad. I don't know if I'm making myself actually clear, but I think it's such a pervasive notion in our minds that it makes us withhold our otherwise indignation about the injustice that we encounter every day, because the violence that we see and how our children are killed on camera, and police killings of our children, and her sense that violence permeates the psyche of the system of white supremacy. So it makes us reserved and fearful, quite frankly, when we understand the way that violence is perpetuated against us and how it impacts how we decide how to respond to it, if I'm making sense. That's my thinking. I'll try to clarify that going forward, but that's my point.
Right on. Appreciate that. I think I grasped your point, because the system of white supremacy is mandatory. They saturate the planet with violence. The system of white supremacy, when you have a minority of people, white people on the planet, controlling the overwhelming population of non-white people on the planet, it requires constant violence, and just seeing that it absolutely does warp our responses, how we think about the world, what we think things should be, even what we aspire to do. Seeing all of this violence play out worldwide, violence specifically targeting dark people. Absolutely. With that, I will assume folks are good. We will get to the second audio clip, and then if we have additional comments, like if you forgot something or you just didn't have time to get your comment in, just make a note and we'll have ample time for folks to share once the second audio segment concludes. So we are still in chapter 17. We're kind of at the midpoint. The sentence where we're picking up on again, it's beyond establishing the physical site, I had to build the right team to staff and run the center. That's what we're picking up at in chapter 17. So this is the autobiography, Coretta Scott King, My Life, My Love, My Legacy, Context of White Supremacy, audio segment number 2.
Beyond establishing the physical site, I had to build the right team to staff and run the center, which also proved, especially initially, to be an experience fraught with growing pains. In the early days of the center, other ideologies were competing with our strategy of nonviolent social change. Hundreds of riots stemmed from Martin's death, and police brutality was rampant. We saw the rise of Black power and Black nationalism, which captured the attention of many young people. For example, Stokely Carmichael, as chairman of SNCC, made a radical departure from the agenda of former SNCC director John Lewis, who had been by Martin's side during the movement and who had been severely beaten as they attempted to march peacefully across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. As Carmichael rose to prominence, he made it clear that white members, once actively recruited to SNCC, were now no longer welcome. Carmichael's slogan of Black Power and the SNCC's new hostility towards whites caught on as the rallying cry of a younger, more radical generation of Black civil rights activists. A clash of values between integration and separatism ensued. Carmichael vocalized his intention to build a movement that would smash everything Western civilization had created. Despite our commitment to nonviolence, overtones of Black nationalism and separatism attempted to make their way through the doors of the King Center via our first executive director, Dr. Vincent Harding. A beautiful human being and history professor on loan to the center from Spelman College, Vincent was the noted author of There is a River and Hope and History. In the 60s, he had worked with Martin as a mediator between Black and white communities. By the early 1970s, however, Vincent had started pushing Malcolm X's thinking over that of Martin's, denouncing whites and pushing for separatism. Of course, it was an apprehensive time. We saw more cities exploding in flames. Angry people were lashing out violently. Many blamed the government, the establishment, for Martin's death. There was so much confusion in this period. Even as I was trying to launch a nonviolent training institute within the center, Vincent was propagating the view that nobody is interested in nonviolence these days, and he went about hiring several young staff members who supported his separatist views. In fact, he went so far as to set up the Institute of the Black World inside the center as an effort to attract more militant proponents to his side. Seeing what was happening, I told him in no uncertain terms there will never be any element in the center where people, no matter who they are or what color they are, cannot participate. Martin wouldn't have stood for this, and I will not stand for this. In addition to our ideological differences, Vincent did not know much about money management. We found that he was spending funds that should have gone to pay taxes to the IRS. In light of how Martin had been harassed and accused of tax fraud, we were shocked. At a board meeting, Vincent finally told us, "Look, the IRS is going to come and close the doors if we don't pay the money we owe them." Daddy King, then a board member, fired back, "Vincent, you had no right to spend the government's money." This mismanagement pushed the center into financial crisis. In an effort to fix the problem and raise the money needed to pay those taxes, we had to take a severe step backward, which meant cutting staff. We were forced to give many of our employees only 2 weeks' notice. You can imagine the fallout. Determined to pick ourselves up and move forward, we called a press conference to introduce our next executive director, Dr. Julius Scott, also a distinguished scholar. He would go on to become president of Payne College in Augusta, Georgia. When I arrived at the press conference to announce the Scott appointment, the furloughed staff members were there with picket signs, passing out a very derogatory statement about me to members of the media. Naturally, I was caught off guard, but I announced the appointment as best I could. The press was not interested in reporting our efforts to move forward, though. They focused on the negative, and it took a while to live down that series of incidents. Vincent Harding went on to establish the Institute of the Black World independently of the center, and for the 2 years that Julius Scott served as executive director, on loan to us from and paid for by Spelman, we successfully developed the Institute on Nonviolence at the King Center, where, under the sponsorship of the National Education Association, we trained educators, labor leaders, community organizers, faith leaders, and students. This institute has been an especially rewarding program for me over the years because I continue to meet people we trained in those workshops and hear about the wonderful things they're doing. But back then, when Julius's time was up, we didn't have money to pay a new executive director. That was a tough time. Our search to run the center ran into other snafus in the early 70s. Probably the most bizarre incident involved Thomas Porter, a graduate from the Antioch School of Education in Seattle, Washington. He had convinced us he was a pro at organizational structure. He also convinced me he was a convert to nonviolence, although I had heard otherwise. I believe in redemption, so I did not hold that hearsay against him. No one believed in him but me, and we soon found that I had made a mistake. Right away, Tom started making demands and publicly saying things that embarrassed us. I took him with me to the Democratic National Convention in California when I endorsed George McGovern. Junius Griffin, who at that time was the publicist for Motown, picked us up in a Rolls-Royce limousine. After that, Tom started giving people the impression that I was running around in big limousines, which the King Center couldn't afford. Then I took him to a black leadership meeting where he embarrassed me by using foul language. He made a big fuss because I didn't get him a room in the main hotel where McGovern was staying. I told him I wanted to meet with him when we returned to the center, but he had the nerve to present me with a negative evaluation of me and the center. I advised him against putting those things in writing, because you can't take it back. Instead of apologizing for his behavior at the next board meeting, he said, "I have to have absolute control of the budget." Andy Young countered, "Tom, you must be planning to resign and go back home." So we gave him 3-month severance, and he left. Our next mistake was that we did not fire Tom's assistant and staff hires, and they sent negative information about the center to the board and others from whom we were seeking help. When we discovered all this, we had to fire Tom's assistant and staff, leaving only 2 people staffing the center. We kept the whole thing quiet, but we had to close the center for 6 weeks until we could regroup. And regroup we did. We kept regrouping. We then brought in Calvin Morris, whom Andy had recommended. Calvin was a good speaker, but he did not have the best administrative skills, and all he wanted to do was speak and preach. And then he left to work on his doctorate. As the center developed, hundreds of staff members with favorable opinions of our work made themselves known. We eventually found excellent directors who helped us stay on course, and in 1979, People magazine's opinion poll named me the most effective among women leaders. Still early on, press about the center sometimes blamed me for the challenges we encountered finding the right director. Hard to work with, they said. Looking back, those hard early years in building a staff were just a few backward steps in what was overall a great march forward. In the decade between 1978 and 1988, we were blessed with several wonderful leaders, such as Maxie Jackson, who came in 1976 but had to leave to resettle his family back in Michigan; Lloyd Davis, on loan from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, who became the center's first executive vice president, followed by Harold Sims, Dr. William Chip Wheeler, Quincy Carswell, and Sonny Walker. These men put the icing on the cake, implementing programs essential to our commitment to nonviolence and social justice, activities that kept the center bustling with commitment, excitement, and purpose. I am also quite proud of the part the center played in revitalizing the Sweet Auburn neighborhood around our complex, an area that has become one of the nation's leading tourist sites, adding millions of dollars to the economy of Atlanta. Even more important, that revitalization made attractive housing surrounding the center available to low-income residents. During the early 1900s, Auburn Avenue, which is east of downtown Atlanta, was the center of life for upwardly mobile blacks. Famous names in black establishments were trademarks. Patriarchs such as Alonzo Herndon, John Wesley Dobbs, and Reverend A.D. Williams, Martin's maternal grandfather, set a tone of pride and dignity. Businesses thrived, such as the Atlanta Daily World, the nation's first black daily newspaper, the Mutual Federal Savings and Loan, and the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, one of the largest black-owned institutions in the nation. The Top Hat nightclub, later named the Royal Peacock, hosted top performers including Bessie Smith, Louis Armstrong, and Gladys Knight and the Pips. A church aristocracy which included Bethel AME, Wheat Street Baptist Church, and Ebenezer Baptist Church, provided a spiritual foundation. By 1960, the Prince Hall Masonic Building on Auburn Avenue housed the SCLC offices as well as a historic radio station. And, of course, in 1970, Martin was interred on Auburn Avenue on what today are the grounds of the Freedom Hall complex at the King Center. It was around 1960, however, shortly after Martin and I moved to Atlanta, when I saw the handwriting on the wall. Urban blight and the migration of wealthier blacks to the suburbs in light of desegregation plans left behind lower-income families without recreation or access to health care and other services. By the 1970s, scores of residential buildings had become eyesores and were being razed. Once prosperous businesses had become shells of their former selves. I hoped to promote the preservation and restoration of this neighborhood, this valuable motherlode of black culture and history, partly by locating the Freedom Hall complex of the King Center in the Auburn area. But the very first beacon of this neighborhood preservation would be the house where Martin was born. 1 year before Martin's assassination, I met with Atlanta's Mayor Ivan Allen to retain his help in restoring Martin's birth home. I had learned that this historic block was slated for demolition, and I wanted to give the community where Martin grew up a facelift, to help change its destiny from deterioration to revitalization. I began to lobby for the home to become a National Historic Site, and the birth home became the first completed portion of my vision for the Martin Luther King Jr. Historic District. At first, we offered tours of the home. Eventually, we invited the National Park Service, NPS, to partner with us and give regular tours to visitors. The birth home, a 2-story Queen Anne frame structure, was built in 1895 and purchased in the early 1900s by Reverend Williams. Mama King, Mrs. Alberta Williams King, grew up in that house. When she gave birth to Martin on January 15, 1929, Daddy King jumped up and touched the ceiling, leaving a handprint, which we embossed so it would remain. The house was, and still is, just a stone's throw from Fire Station No. 6, where Martin had chased fire trucks as a boy, and just a few feet from the King Center Freedom Hall complex. The designation of Martin's home as an historic site made him the first black American whose birth home earned recognition from the National Register of Historic Places. Because of our efforts, Ebenezer Church subsequently received a similar designation, and these efforts opened the way for additional funds for the Auburn Avenue restorations from state and private preservation organizations. We also received funds for the restoration of the birth home from sororities, Alpha Kappa Alpha, the Grand Chapter of Sigma Gamma Rho, and the Atlanta Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta. Work on the restoration of the home was completed in 1974. Mama King worked diligently with me and Christine on the restoration and took special pride in supervising the painting, wallpapering, and selection of most of the furniture. She played an indispensable role in helping us complete the birth home. Unfortunately, a tragic turn of events made it so that she wasn't with us when the home was dedicated in 1975. On June 30th, 1974, she was shot and killed at Ebenezer while she sat at the organ playing the Lord's Prayer. Mama King, whom Daddy King called Bunch, was not a public figure, but she was deeply loved within the family and at her church. Indeed, Mama King had much more influence than one might guess. Martin used to say, "You know who the real pastor in the church is? Mother." Sometimes she would call Martin at 6 a.m. and tell him in her heavy voice what she thought he should be doing at the church. It seemed she never slept. She also did a lot of grandmothering and would take care of all the children from time to time when I traveled. Sometimes she watched after my kids, Naomi's kids, and Christine's kids at the same time. They would all play together, and Mama and Daddy King would get so much joy out of having all their grandkids together. On that awful Sunday morning, the church pews were full as Mama King began to play the organ, the melody flowing through the sanctuary. She had a natural talent for music, and she served as the minister of music, directing some of the choirs at Ebenezer. Some of the deacons remembered that a young man, definitely a first-time visitor, came to the sanctuary just before service began and asked, "Is Reverend King preaching today?" The deacon responded, "No." An usher seated the man near the front, to the left of the pulpit, on a pew right next to the Hammond B3 organ where Mama King was seated. Daddy King and Christine were sitting in the first pew, to the right of the pulpit. As Mama King was playing the Lord's Prayer, the young man shouted, "I'm taking over this morning." There was a popping sound, and Daddy King saw Bunch's hand fly to her face, blood streaming through her fingers. She fell forward, holding her side. The bullets were still flying. The young man had 2 guns, one in either hand, and he started shooting wildly across the church. He shot and killed one of the deacons, Edward Boykin. Another member of the congregation was also shot, but later recovered. Other deacons restrained Daddy King, who was frantically trying to reach for his wife of 48 years. The man pointed his weapons at the choir members and even at Daddy King's grandson, Reverend Derek King, who was in the pulpit that day. The man kept trying to fire, but he had emptied his gun's chambers. He became frightened and tried to run out of the church. Derek tackled him and started beating him. If the police had not rushed in, the young man, later identified as 23-year-old Marcus Wayne Chenault, might have died on the spot. All these intricate and heart-rending details were relayed to me the moment my plane landed. I had been in Chicago giving a speech for the National Education Association. Dexter had already gone to the church earlier with his cousins. He was at the store across the street from the church when the shooting started. When I called the house to wake up the other children for Sunday school, I called too late. I had forgotten that Chicago was an hour behind Atlanta. As soon as Dexter heard about the shooting, he ran back across the street to the church, and before Mama King was moved to the ambulance, he saw her in a pool of blood. Still, in retrospect, I was comforted that all of my children at least were spared the horror of seeing their grandmother, whom they adored, shot down in front of their eyes in church, of all places. A few weeks after the murder, Daddy King insisted that he meet with Chenault in prison. When he asked, "Why did you do it, son?" Chenault rambled on about Christians being his enemies. He was completely incoherent, making no sense at all. Eventually he was found guilty of the attack and sentenced to die in the electric chair. Ironically, Andrea Young, Andrew Young's daughter, happened to be a lawyer with the firm that aided indigent prisoners and was representing Chenault. She was working to get his sentence commuted to life in prison. She came to me for advice, and I told her that while I didn't believe in the death penalty, she had to talk through the case with Daddy King and Christine, who was suffering tremendously. He had lost both his sons, and she, her 2 brothers, first Martin and then A.D., who was found dead in his own pool under suspicious circumstances a year after Martin's death. Now, tragically, he had lost his wife, and Christine had lost her mother. Watching the way Daddy King handled himself was a great inspiration to me. It was wonderful to see forgiveness and the love of Christ flow so freely. I remember him saying, "There are 2 men I'm supposed to hate. One is white and the other is black. James Earl Ray is a prisoner in Tennessee charged with killing my son. Marcus Chenault is in a Georgia penitentiary after killing my wife. Nothing that a man does takes him lower than when he allows himself to stoop so low as to hate someone. I love the lesson of love triumphing over evil too much to make room in my heart for hate. Our family had suffered so many tragedies in 6 short years. They kept us on our knees, praying for strength, and we found the strength to push past our pain and continue on our mission, which we had been uniquely challenged to carry out. Sooner or later our comforter would come. We had to keep growing, keep building, and keep moving on. Shortly after revitalizing Martin's birth home, we bought the adjacent house at 503 Auburn Avenue and used it as temporary administrative offices for the King Center. Next, as part of revitalizing the Auburn neighborhood, I went to work on building a community center, which would include a gymnasium, a game room, a library, and an early learning center, community services, and a fountain, as well as a separate natatorium. The community around the proposed center badly needed social, cultural, and recreational resources for children and young adults. To provide for these necessities, I had to do some serious lobbying with officials in the city and with the Nixon administration. Cutting a path through the Nixon labyrinth was no easy task. For years, I've known that the FBI was smearing me as an anti-American subversive. The media had also reported that Patrick Buchanan, Nixon's speechwriter, had warned the president against meeting with me on the first anniversary of Martin's birthday, claiming that such a visit would outrage many people who believed Dr. King was a fraud and a demagogue, and perhaps worse. Dr. King is one of the most divisive men in contemporary history. Some believe him to be a messiah, others consider him the devil incarnate. Still, I appealed to President Nixon for funds. After all, he was elected to be the president of all the people, and we were trying to build upon what was good and proper about our country, an effort we hoped even Nixon would want to be a part of. I called his office and told him that we were building a memorial for my husband and needed his help for the community center. Through one of his deputies, we were promised help and told that he would get his best people working on it. That never happened. Later we were told there was no money. And later still, we learned the real reason. Beyond Nixon's personal dislike for the King family, Herman Talmadge and Richard B. Russell, Jr., 2 U.S. senators from Georgia, had scotched the funding. Subsequently, Nixon passed word to all his cabinet directors and heads of various agencies that there would be no money for the community center or the memorial. There was a rumor of a bizarre idea. The Nixon administration would offer us a recording of the 1970 birthday White House concert for Duke Ellington, which we could sell to raise money. This was an insult. Of course, we appreciated Duke Ellington, but we were against the administration trying to pass off his birthday concert as monetarily significant. Yet, as the scripture teaches, just when Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac, a ram in the bush appeared as a substitute. There's always a ram in the bush. In this case, the ram that saved the day was George Romney, Secretary of HUD. As the former governor of Michigan, Romney had made high-level appointments of African Americans. Through that pipeline, he tapped Lloyd Davis, a former member of the Kennedy administration, and it turned out a future executive director of the King Center, and assigned him to review our application for funding. Romney wanted to ensure that all equal opportunity and fair housing requirements had been met, and since they were, he made sure discretionary funds were directed to us. With those funds, along with the matching funds raised by me and other grants, we amassed the estimated $3 million necessary to build our community center and provide much-needed social and recreational services. We held the ribbon-cutting ceremonies during King Birthday Week in January 1976. At the community center, we had an early learning center, a reading academy, thanks to additional right-to-read funding from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and neighborhood services to train young people in nonviolence. We were also able to provide direct housing and food assistance to Sweet Auburn residents in need, and if there were problems our staff could not handle directly, whether with utility bills, child care, transportation, or employment, we referred those in needs to the proper agencies. In addition, we maintained a presence on the corporate and non-profit boards which allowed us to channel aid to needy communities through personal networking. Seeing how the community center made a difference was thrilling to me. And the natatorium, the Olympic-sized swimming pool connected by a walkway to the community center, was used by many local swim teams and also attracted national swim meets. It was one of the nicest pools in Atlanta, which also made me happy. One reason I wanted that pool was because in Marion, Alabama, where I grew up, we were not allowed to swim in public pools, which were for whites only, and as a child I almost drowned trying to learn to swim in a pond which looked like a big, dark hole to me. I was afraid to get in that pond in the first place, and after I did, I never learned to swim. I wanted the next generation to have a different experience. Similarly, I never learned to play tennis because we didn't have tennis courts in Marion, so we constructed 2 courts near the natatorium. All the things I didn't have as a child, I tried to provide through the community center. I put in early learning programs because I remembered how my lack of early training made it difficult for me to keep up in college. To see the children coming to the early learning center was really gratifying. Of course, over the years, a great many extraordinary entertainers, from Flip Wilson to Stevie Wonder to Michael Jackson to Bono, visited the center and contributed to its work. But another Atlanta cultural issue I was blessed to be able to address during the 1970s was opera. Blacks in Atlanta, as in other southern cities, had not been allowed to attend opera performances during the days of segregation. As a concert singer and someone who loved opera and the arts in general, I wanted this barrier to come down. I worked with Rudolph Bing, the general manager for the Metropolitan Opera, to make tickets available to blacks and to members of all races. And because the Fox Theater, where operas in Atlanta were performed, was teetering on the edge of financial collapse, I worked with local residents to save it, restore it to its original grandeur. By 1980, after our major campaign of lobbying the White House and Congress, the King Center Board of Directors and I succeeded in getting legislation passed to establish the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site. And in 1981, after years spent collecting the largest inventory of civil rights documents in the world related to the modern civil rights movement, including an oral history project, the center formally opened the administration building, which houses the King Library and Archives. The building was opened for staff, and the library and archives were opened to scholars and researchers from around the world, and, initially, the center was also able to offer exhibitions to the public in the building. In addition, that same year we worked with the City of Atlanta and the U.S. Department of Labor to train youth to provide services to senior citizens, such as minor home repairs and escort assistance, which helped 2 underserved populations and provided a service model for the nation. On January 15, 1982, as part of the week-long observance of Martin's 53rd birthday, we celebrated the final construction of the Freedom Hall complex. This completed the entire building phase of the center. Until 1982, when we used the term center, we were referring to our organization, a work in progress housed in temporary offices. But in 1982, all our staff and programs were finally in their own administration building. We had come home at last. The completed complex also consisted of the International Chapel of All Faiths, the Freedom Walkway, Freedom Hall, a conference center with meeting rooms and a 250-seat auditorium, the screening room, the reflecting pool, Martin's crypt, on an island in the pool, and the eternal flame, symbolizing Martin's lifelong commitment to justice and peace. The idea of a reflecting pool had come to me during my visit to the Taj Mahal in Agra, India, during my book tour in 1970. I saw this beautiful reflecting pool leading up to the mausoleum of white marble built by Emperor Shah Jahan in 1653 in memory of his third wife. It is a symbol of love. Martin's crypt, which sits on a circular island in the center of the reflecting pool, was also a labor of love. At one end of the pool are several tiers, with 5 fountains on the top tier representing the 5 races in humanity, and water cascades down from them, reminding me of that scripture in the book of Amos, "Let justice rain down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream." Inscribed on the white marble crypt are Martin's famous words, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last." I believe that it is only right that the caring community that helped produce a Martin Luther King Jr. not deteriorate, but remain creative, vibrant, and illustrious. Sweet Auburn is a part of a legacy that keeps producing something better. Today, the neighborhood offers us a unique opportunity to experience the environment that produced the man who sacrificed his life to save us. And within it stands the King Center, both a social and sacred space, a pilgrimage destination with an estimated 1 million visitors from around the world every year, and most of all, through its educational and training programs, an epicenter for nonviolent change both societally and interpersonally. From the very moment the center began, with meager resources and a dispersed and inadequate administrative home, it still managed to do what mattered most: continue Martin's unfinished work through education, research, advocacy, and nonviolence training. We did not allow the naysayers or our own missteps to bog us down or distract us from our mission. Martin believed that each person could make a difference, and I believed that the King Center could help each person obtain the tools to make that difference without violence. Even before we opened our doors, we offered education and training for every age group. At the preschool level, the children sang songs and learned poems in the spirit of nonviolence. Our emphasis was on love and concern for the kids, and our programs for college students soon included a scholars internship program, through which students learned Kingian nonviolence and got on-the-job training for internships in government offices or in social service organizations, where they had the chance to apply the principles they had learned at the center. They also received credit for their learning and work from their colleges or universities. By 1980, 80 students had gone through that program. Also, even before we had a building, we had an institute on nonviolence, which brought adults from as far as California and Maine for week-long and summer workshops. In its first 20 years, the center led more than 20 educational programs and more than a dozen community and public affairs programs, such as the New Coalition of Conscience and the American Indian Forum. At the core of the center, its heart and soul, has been nonviolence education and training, which we have provided to tens of thousands of people through the years. In one 1984 program alone, we partnered with the FBI to train 25,000 young people in nonviolence. Also, every year we bring in about 300 young people to our Summer Institute on Nonviolence. We also host the top executives of law enforcement groups, judges, and prison personnel. Our goal is to use my husband's philosophy and strategies to demonstrate alternatives to violence. The center's police training started in the early 1990s because of Charles Alphin Sr., a St. Louis police captain who began visiting the center on his own time in the 1980s to learn the techniques of nonviolence. He then applied them in the communities where he worked. Eventually, with his help, our Summer Institute for Youth expanded and included family members Martin III, Bernice, Derek, Vernon, and Angela Farris as trainers. In an effort to test the value of our nonviolent program, Charles began bringing busloads of youth from St. Louis to the Center for Nonviolent workshops. One particular youth was a gang member who had been involved in a drive-by shooting. A kind judge let him out of juvenile detention to attend our workshops along with 20 other youths. When he returned home, he vowed not to fight anymore despite being harassed for his decision. When he was released from detention, he returned to the center to delight us with his turnaround. He became active in our training programs and completely changed his life. After Charles retired from the police force in 1992, I encouraged him to come work for the center as a trainer, and later, after I promoted him to Director of Education and Training, our police training programs expanded nationally. A youth and law enforcement training at the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles was one of many such programs. One of the success stories I'm most proud of is our work with the police department in Miami that credited us with helping it prevent the kinds of riots that occurred in Los Angeles in 1992 after acquittal of the white police officer involved in the beating of unarmed black motorist Rodney King. After those riots, the Los Angeles PD called upon us for assistance in keeping the peace. We attended a summit with gang leaders, the Crips and the Bloods, at the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Hospital in Watts. I listened and spoke, and later invited gang members to the center, facing strenuous objections for doing so. XXXOG is the highest level of gang memberships, yet Charles Rashal, a XXXOG Crip leader, and Bobby Lavender, a XXXOG Blood member, were among the 9 gang leaders who accepted my invitation. On the heels of the training, I became fond of both men. We exposed any number of gang members to Kingian nonviolence as a lifestyle. It was gratifying to see how these young people, coming to the center from various urban communities with no understanding of nonviolence at all, could choose Martin's teachings as a viable antidote to violence. By 1984, the King Center had expanded its role as an international institution. We incorporated and pulled from what we had learned on the battlefields of America to build training materials that were in tune with diverse cultures and could be translated into various languages. We embraced the vision of the center as a world house where people of disparate ideologies could embrace a common ideology of peace. We trained some of our staff to become globetrotters, to literally stand between warring factions without being labeled spies or intruders. In 1985, the center used Martin's birthday week to focus attention on world hunger and poverty, which were at unprecedented levels and which represented violence in one of its ugliest and most basic forms. I spoke about the conditions in some developing nations where the annual average income was less than $300. Our brothers and sisters in those countries lack even a survivable diet. They take in a daily deficit of calories and nutrients that hinders the growth of their bodies and minds and permanently handicaps their countries. We issued a charge for all nations to wage an unconditional war not on any nation or people, but on poverty, racism, and violence. In 1989, we continued our efforts to get the U.S. corporate community to further its divestment in South Africa as a nonviolent way of fighting apartheid. We also used the center's offices and facilities as a nonviolent forum in which the opposing South African parties might mediate their differences and work for national reconciliation. From the beginning, our trainings drew on Martin's scores of books, speeches, and sermons, but we turned to 3 sources in particular to teach his worldview and his concept of Kingian nonviolence. The Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, a chapter from his book Stride Toward Freedom, the letter from a Birmingham jail, which is in the book Why We Can't Wait, and The World House, the last chapter from his 1967 book Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, as well as excerpts from his Nobel lecture and his close identification with the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. We gleaned from Martin's writings the clearest statements on nonviolence and abbreviated them to become the center's 6 principles of nonviolence, which, along with Martin's 6 steps of nonviolence, are the basis of everything we teach. The Center's 6 principles of nonviolence are: 1. Nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. It is an active, not a passive, form of resistance to evil. 2. Those who practice nonviolence must seek to win friendship and understanding from their adversaries and not try to vanquish, humiliate, or defeat them. 3. Those who practice nonviolence recognize that evildoers are not evil people, and that they are often victims of systemic injustice themselves. Therefore, we seek to defeat injustice and not people. 4. Unearned suffering for a just cause is redemptive because it can educate and win the hearts of adversaries and the public. This understanding empowers the nonviolence practitioner to accept suffering without retaliation, so as to advance the victory of a just cause. 5. Nonviolence is rooted in unconditional love instead of hate. By recognizing that all life is interrelated, nonviolence resists violence of the spirit as well as of the body. 6. Faith in the ultimate triumph of justice empowers the nonviolence practitioner to endure suffering and defeat as temporary phenomena. Knowing that justice will prevail because God is just and the universe is on the side of justice. We have always coupled the 6 principles of nonviolence with the Kingian 6 steps of nonviolence. 1. Information gathering. Gather as much data as possible about the problem and the conflict from all sides. 2. Educate the community about the information we have gathered. 3. Make a personal commitment to solving the problem and resolving the conflict nonviolently, checking motives along the way. 4. Negotiate. Meet with the opposition, discuss differences, and try to come to a win-win resolution. If negotiations fail, only then do we go to step 5. 5. Direct action. Direct action can take the form of economic withdrawal, such as boycotts or picketing or marches, protests, or other types of demonstrations. 6. Reconciliation. The goal is to reestablish community and, ultimately, to create the beloved community about which people have heard me talk so often. I am so proud of the ongoing education and training in nonviolence that is the heart of the King Center's work. Will there ever be true reconciliation out of conflict and violence through nonviolent means? Will the disparities between rich and poor no longer exist? And will each person have, as Martin wanted, 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits? Will the human family lead to the realization of the beloved community? Will people achieve peace within themselves, each other, their families, their communities, their nations? I still believe, as I said once to an interviewer at Ebony magazine, that because of so many ongoing social ills and injustices, another movement is inevitable. It is interesting how a movement is triggered at a certain moment in history. I can't help but believe that at some time in the not-too-distant future, there is going to be another movement to change the systemic conditions of poverty, injustice, and violence in people's lives. That is where we've got to go, and it is going to be a struggle. When that struggle comes, those who have been trained in Kingian nonviolence will be ready. All those years we were building the King Center and revitalizing Sweet Auburn, I challenged myself and the center board and staff to extend our ideals and be Martin's voice in action. I never stopped speaking out for justice outside Atlanta's city limits as well as within them, making hundreds of speeches, engaging with blacks, women, the physically challenged, gays, and poor and deprived children. I used my nationally syndicated newspaper column and my thrice weekly show on CNN to help give voice to my husband's vision. In 1979, the Center's Board of Directors drew up its first legislative agenda, which included calling for implementation of the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment Act, for full voting rights for the District of Columbia, for the Martin Luther King Jr. Birthday Bill, for the Equal Rights Amendment, and for ratification of the UN Human Rights Covenants. In 1984, the year French President François Mitterrand visited, the King Center had already become an international institution, a world house where people of disparate ideologies could embrace a common ideology of peace. Distinguished international visitors included Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega, Prime Minister Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, the King and Queen of Nepal, and prime ministers, cabinet-level ministers, and official delegations from Canada, England, India, Japan, Kenya, Liberia, Romania, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, the Soviet Union, West Africa, and West Germany, to name a few. And in 1986, during the first national holiday, the King Center, in conjunction with Ebenezer Baptist Church, where I worship, hosted the National Conference Against Apartheid, which was attended by a powerful list of religious leaders, from Reverend Joseph Lowry, then head of the SCLC, to Bishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa. Ambassadors from several nations, U.S. State Department officials, presidents of trade unions and colleges, and heads of prominent South African and international action, among others. The National March and Parade following the conference was attended by thousands, including former President Jimmy Carter, who was honorary Grand Marshal, Mrs. Rosa Parks, and Peter V. Uberoff, the Commissioner of Major League Baseball, were Grand Marshals. The U.S. Air Force provided a flyover tribute to Martin. Also, from the beginning, the center was a site for important commemorations and celebrations that helped keep Martin's message alive. Every year, starting in 1973, the King Center presented the Martin Luther King Jr. Nonviolent Peace Prize to a world citizen who embodied and emulated Martin's spirit and mission. Andrew Young, Cesar Chavez, Representative John Lewis, Representative Joseph Lowry, Randolph Blackwell, Benjamin Mays, Stanley Levison, Zambian President Kenneth Kaunda, President Jimmy Carter, Rosa Parks, former Atlanta Mayor Ivan Allen, Harry Belafonte, Martin Luther King Sr., Sir Richard Attenborough, President Corazon Aquino of the Philippines, and the Reverend Jesse Jackson all received the prize. And in 1990, we presented the award to Mikhail Gorbachev, the last General Secretary of the Soviet Union, who brought about massive economic, social, and political changes and helped bring an end to both the Soviet Union and the Cold War. One of the center commemorations of which I am most proud occurred in 1988. I had long been concerned about the lack of proper recognition given to women who participated in the civil rights movement. The King Center organized a conference to address the issue and was able to get the Division of Continuing Education of Georgia State University to sponsor it with us. This conference, entitled Women in the Civil Rights, Trailblazers, and Torchbearers, was one of the most historic events held on the issue. Some 200 women from diverse racial, cultural, economic, and professional backgrounds came together to discuss new directions and a future agenda for women. We honored Rosa Parks at the conference on the occasion of her 75th birthday, acknowledging her contributions with a special exhibit at the center and hailing her as the mother of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. A conference room in Freedom Hall was dedicated in her honor. In conjunction with the conference, I established a Trailblazers and Torchbearers Advisory Board, which included Juanita Abernathy, Joan Baez, Daisy Bates, Mary Frances Berry, Unita Blackwell, Zernona Clayton Brady, Marion Wright Edelman, Christine Farris, Eleanor Holmes Norton, Rosa Parks, Bernice Johnson Reagan, Majeska Simpkins, Maxine Waters, and Jean Young. Even though I acknowledge and celebrate all these and many more King Center milestones and other successes, I was humbled and surprised when a reporter looking for a comparison asked me to name another African American woman who had built an institution from the ground up that was hailed internationally as a tourist destination. I hadn't thought about my accomplishments in those terms, and the truth is that contributions of all kinds came to the King Center from labor, civil, and human rights groups, from arts communities, fraternities, and sororities, from prayer warriors and people of faith from around the globe, from corporations, large and small, from legislative leaders across the nation, both Democrats and Republicans, and from international diplomatic corps, U.S. presidents, and heads of state from around the world. The King Center is a mecca for spiritual growth and activism, safeguarding and championing Martin's legacy to all nations. It has spurred redevelopment in Atlanta, creating a citadel of diversity that helped attract the 1996 Summer Olympics and that continues to draw visitors from around the globe. I never expected to see so many people close to me who wanted this child of mine stillborn. Nevertheless, out of much pain and with much prayer, the King Center came forth. As with my flesh and blood children, I am a proud parent. In the decade after Martin's death, it was of utmost importance to me to put my children first, to make sure they knew how special and loved they were. I could see the difference that this was making almost daily. I remember Martin III telling me, "Mama, a kid can live without a father, but no kid can make it without a mother." Yet all my children knew they had to share me with my fifth child. There were times of agony and times of joy, but there are no regrets, especially when I see what the center means to the world. This miraculous center was conceived in me and birthed by thousands of midwives, and my other children will finish raising up this sibling of theirs to independent adulthood when I am gone.
Context of White Supremacy. That will wrap chapter 17. So when we pick up next week, we'll be on chapter 18. We must learn to disagree without being disagreeable. If you have commentary you would like to share, the number to dial 641-715-3640. The code 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. Number again, 641-715-3640. Code 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. We should have about 25 minutes, maybe a little more, for folks to share any thoughts, if anything stood out from the second audio segment. For the folks who have a hand up, line should be open. Please do not wait until the last minute if you have commentary that you would like to share. If you have a question, thought, something stood out, go ahead and get your hand up now. That way we can hear what you have to say. If you didn't get to share at all, you should definitely get your hand up now so that you can make sure that we get your commentary in. Everyone who has a hand up, line should be open. Feel free if you have commentary.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I thought it was quite a simplistic description of Kwame Ture. His thoughts were, and his input was much more vast than that. Maybe for some reason she didn't have time to give a more accurate description. I have down here also, nonviolence cannot effectively become a way of life until the system of racist white supremacy is neutralized and replaced with a system of justice. Number four, the next one I have is pardoning. I've heard through this last reading of partnering with the FBI, and what came to my mind for some reason is I'm thinking is equivalent to like the JDL partnering with the Nazi Party, which doesn't make any sense. Back to Mr. Teray, he argued that nonviolence can be used as a strategy, not a way of life. Was one of Mr. Teray's thoughts. Once again, the word reconciliation, when I hear it, I cringe. Same thing with the word apartheid. I cringe. And last but not least, the armed forces participation. I heard the word partnered with the armed forces is encouraged while expounding nonviolence as a way of life. Somewhere there's a conflict with volunteering an organization whose primary objective is massive and devastating violence. I mean, to the point of dropping a bomb atomic bomb on non-white people in Japan. But anyway, it's interesting reading, and like to keep participating in it. Thank you.
May I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if it was maybe just my phone or not, but it seemed like the text was kind of skipping around. I first really started, because I got the Kindle edition, I noticed it when they started talking about, like, the shooting of Mama King, but I wanted to point out one thing in the text when she was talking about trying to lobby to help get funds for the center, and one part in the book it says that when she was referring to like the Nixon administration and what they felt about Dr. King, it says King was one of the most divisive men in contemporary history. Some believe him to be a messiah. Others consider him the devil incarnate. I definitely thought that was telling. At least I kind of felt like maybe she had a little bit more clarity with that. Another thing that stuck out with me, because I seem to hear it a lot when it comes to speaking about quote-unquote groups that are like subjugated. It'll be blacks and then women and then gays and then whatever, almost as if I understand, of course, that black women or black females can't necessarily be women, but I definitely see that it's almost like you can't be both, especially with her thoughts on how, like, what she's calling black females women in the civil rights movement. Another thing was but she was speaking about the principles, and what really stuck out to me was the number 3, those who practice nonviolence recognize that evildoers are not evil people and that they are often victims of systematic injustice themselves, which was definitely very confusing to me. It's like, it's almost saying that, white people are victims, but they're also the ones who are practicing racism. I guess I'll just leave it there. There are other things that I saw, but that's all I have to share for now. Thank you.
It seemed like it fast forwarded a little bit at some portions, right when Mama King was assassinated at the church, and then it kind of stopped at the end. I'm gonna make sure the archives do not have an issue with the playback. Did any other folks that we haven't heard from have commentary?
Yes, may I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I wanted to speak on Mama King's murder in the church. You know, when she spoke, I guess his name was Marcus Chenault. You know, it seemed as if she had more to say. Maybe she'll get around to James Earl Ray, but the white man who killed, murdered her husband, you know, she hadn't mentioned anything about this guy, and I don't know if the book's going to get to it, but suspicious circumstances. He was in escape from prison, you know, was over a year on the run, had went overseas and back, especially after he murdered Dr. King, you know, had a ticket paid for overseas and all that. It's all very suspicious. And the files that they had concerning, the FBI had concerning that, you know, was never released. And then this deranged black man, which, you know, the way they described him, you know, the way it states, you know, when you read about him, he said that he actually went in there to get Daddy King, but I guess settled for, you know, Mama King and some of the choir members. And then she didn't state that the choir members overtook this guy and held him until the law officials got there. So, you know, I guess this church shooting, you know, has gone back as far back as we can remember. You know, if you think about it, you're sitting inside of a structure and you're singing, you come now to get some spiritual uplift, you know, and if there's no security and you're basically just sitting ducks. And then it just goes to show that the way everything is set up, we don't even know if this guy wasn't put up to doing that. But it seems like Dr. King's entire family was under assault. And his mother's dead, his brother, himself, you know, it's just, you know, I don't see how you can get anything redemptive out of any of that. And, you know, I'll just mute my line. Thanks.
Yes, sir. Other folks who dialed in with a hand up, if you have commentary, feel free. The caller, matter of fact, the caller at 3637, you should speak now because I don't think we've heard from you.
Oh, hi. Hey, this is caller from the 712. Hello, everyone.
Greetings.
I'm trying to figure if I got this right. Did it say that Mrs. King brought the top gang leaders in to talk to them about the Rodney King beating and the violence?
Yes, you heard that correctly.
Well, that's funny. I'm kind of trying to figure out why wouldn't you bring the police officers in that did the beating? That's the only question I had. I don't know. Maybe I'm not linking it up right, but I thought it all got started because Rodney King got beat by 18 police or 30 police or something.
Good point. Good rhetorical question. Maybe they did, or maybe they sent them an invitation as well. But yeah, it says. Oh wait, let me give the full paragraph in case people didn't hear. It says after those LA riots, the Los Angeles Police Department called upon us for assistance in keeping the peace. We attended the summit with the gang leaders, the Crips and the Bloods, as the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Hospital in Watts. I listened and spoke, and later invited gang members to the center, facing strenuous objections from doing so. She doesn't specify whom objected. That's even more ironic. The LAPD did not call her in for sensitivity training for why you shouldn't reference black people as niggers and apes and what have you, or beat them as they did Rodney King. It was, can you help us with our nigger problem? Can you deal with these? Great question. Great question.
It really was. And for I didn't know that Mama King was shot by a black person. I always, in my misinformed self, always thought it was a racist white supremacist that shot her. And I always thought their family was targeted. When I found that out, I think I found that out like last year or the year before, I always thought, well, maybe their family is targeted for something. But that was my thinking, everyone. And I'll mute my line. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. I'm learning a lot. I didn't know about Dr. King's brother dying suspiciously in a swimming pool. I wish she had given more. Maybe that's coming, but I wish she had given more information about that. But that Tupac Shakur, I think that is a major pattern for folks who followed. It tends to be, if you are a black person, Minister Malcolm as well, think about his grandson, his father. If you are a black person and you do something to try to work against racism, the general pattern is we're not just going to try to mess things up for you. It's going to be you and your parents, children, siblings, nieces, neighbors. Like that generally is the pattern that racists, you try to make sure that they send the message very clearly to everybody, because sometimes it won't just be you, it'll be the whole town of black people, right? They've done that before too. So it just depends on how much of a point of emphasis race soldiers want to make. Anybody else have commentary? Do we get everybody? Everybody who has a hand up, get to share. Miss anybody?
You can add Mrs. Shabazz to that list also.
All right. Lengthy. I remember that. I think James Meredith, who's been mentioned in this book, I think he said that Dr. King was a huge fan of James Meredith, who's still alive. Would love to get him on the program. He said, and this is something, you talk about courage, who faced down mobs in Mississippi, and they mentioned in the book, got shot, the March Against Fear. And Mississippi could have been killed easily at any time. White people were killing other white people, upset about James Meredith going to University of Mississippi. He said that the thing that was most difficult for him was not the stuff that white people did to him. He was also a veteran, get that in, Mr. Meredith, but not what racists were doing to him, but what white supremacists were doing to his family. I've heard that consistently, folks saying that was the thing that, was most difficult for them to deal with, having their parents or siblings, children harassed, violently accosted, that sort of thing. Even the phone calls that we've, Mrs. King has talked about consistently, that sort of thing really, really has bothered a lot of non-white people, and it seems that's one of the things that racists absolutely got on their list. Make sure we do. Unless folks are good, I'll share my few thoughts, and then we might be close to the end. Did we miss anybody? Right on. I'll get to my few notes from the second session. Let's see. So this is all first session stuff. Okay. So this is second book in a row where we had a mention of Dr. Vincent Harding. If people remember from Delectable Negro, Dr. Harding was one of the scholars who was objected to William Styron's portrayal of Nat Turner. Right, folks, remember? Right. Last book that we read, mentioned twice in a row. I thought that was pretty interesting as what might be another illustration, and I'm not saying that what Dr. Harding, what was reported in this book was correct in terms of if there was some financial mismanagement, or at least it seems that they had different views on racism, counter-racism, which is pretty common. Maybe it wouldn't have been the best fit for their organization, but that might seem like another illustration of her showing some of her frustrations with black people that I just don't hear directed at racist woman, racist man, racist child. I don't know what "quote unquote" separatism is. She used that term, saying that this flavor of black nationalism and separatism. I have no idea what that is. You do not separate to end racism, white supremacy. I too thought that was a great analysis. Retired firefighter saying that we got a very abbreviated discussion of Kwame Ture, also known as Stokely Carmichael, Ready for Revolution. If you want to read his autobiography, great read. Lots of information. He was very informed of the systemic terrorism targeting black people, and he talks in great detail about this quote-unquote hostility towards whites. And a lot of that, even some of that we talked about with Lauren Cress Love, a lot of that was, why are you here? If you're really interested in solving this problem, you should go back and work with white people, which is totally logical. You do not need to come down here and frolic in the bushes in Mississippi or Alabama for your summer vacation. You can go home and work with the white people where you are and get some of these problems solved if that's what you're really interested in doing. Very logical, big to do. As I said, you can go back and even hear what Lauren Cress Love, Dr. Welsing's sister, who was a member of SNCC, you can hear some of her thoughts about what transpired with all of this. Where she says angry people were lashing out violently. Many blame the government, the establishment, for Martin's death. Isn't that so? Isn't that true? Man, we had William Pepper on the program. And again, I don't know how far this is going to get. Now, if this book, she didn't pass until 2006, there was a trial that addressed this. Is the government culpable in Dr. King's death? There was a trial that addressed this in the 90s. So that should come up in the book. We will have to see, because there should be a definitive answer to that question. And maybe they were correct to be upset and to blame the government and hold them accountable for Dr. King's assassination, along with a whole lot of other black people that died during this time period. Continuing. I already talked about that. Got that. Let's see. The part where she talks about how she wanted the King Center to be there as a way to revitalize that portion of Atlanta. The King Center is pretty close to downtown Atlanta, very like walking distance from downtown Atlanta for people who haven't been to the area. I don't know what it looks like now. It's been a few years since I've been to Atlanta, but I lived there like in the 2000s, and I've gone back to visit since I no longer lived there. Man, and I can put it in total context. I've been to the King Center. I've been to the King Center after nightfall. I've been at the King Center after 11 p.m. I don't think most people, unless it's changed radically, I don't think most people, if you just got dropped down at the King Center and were told, okay, your car is at 5 Points, which is downtown Atlanta. You got to walk from here to 5 Points to get to your vehicle. That's probably, if memory serves, you definitely could do that in 30 minutes. You could do that, I think, leisurely in 30 minutes to get to your car, not a marathon or anything. I don't think most people would want to take that walk at night at 11 p.m., even after sunfall, at sundown. I'm saying that just to say I would not agree that that area has been revitalized. Now, I don't know what it looked like in the 1980s. Maybe it looked sizably worse than it is at the time that I saw it. Maybe that's true. Maybe it looks great now. But I know when I was there, which was not ancient history, it did not look great, and I think a whole lot of people would have major concerns about being there late in the evening. I think it's even recommended that you not just be dawdling and hanging out late in the evening. And again, all of that is by design. This is, racist. This is what they do. Make sure that and there's a lot of black people in Atlanta. We're going to make sure the areas where we have a whole lot of black people, those are not going to be the shiny, sparkly, clean parts of the city. That's textbook white supremacy. When she goes on, she says, man, it just seems like a lot of trauma. And again, with the targeting of the whole King family, it just seems like astronomical trauma from day one. That's what this whole book is about. I've been saying that repeatedly. Everything, just the bombings, the violence, in the church of all places, reminding me of Dylan Storm Roof, and repeatedly having these bombings at churches and killings at churches, and bombings of houses and assassinations of people. It just seems like astronomical trauma, and I just was not aware. That alone, I have a lot more respect for Mrs. King and everything that she endured, and still trying to go out and be active and trying to do what she could, even though I don't, have the same view that she does about white people and, a lot of things, which is no problem there either, VGQ. But I certainly have tremendous regard for everything that she has endured to continue with her effort to fight against racism, white supremacy for the duration of her existence. Let's see. Oh, I thought that was great. This was one I thought that was important. And this is what I mean. I want to make sure I get this passage in because I don't know if it came through in the reading, where she's talking about some of the white people and their response to her efforts, where she says the media also reported that Patrick Buchanan, Nixon's speechwriter, Sabrina Johnson just mentioned some of his books when she visited with us, had warned the president against meeting with me on the first anniversary of Martin's birthday, claiming that such a visit would outrage many, many people who believe Dr. King was a fraud and a demagogue, and perhaps worse. Dr. King is one of the most divisive men in contemporary history. Some believe him to be a messiah. Others consider him the devil incarnate, all in quotes from future presidential candidate Patrick Buchanan. Death of the West, I think is the book Dr. Welsing talked about. I just don't hear like bitterness the same way that she talked about some of the SCLC and what have you. And I mean, this is disparaging her the devil incarnate. Like, wow. Like heavy stuff from Mr. Buchanan. Continuing. There was a rumor of a bizarre idea the Nixon administration would offer us a recording of the 1970 birthday White House concert for Duke Ellington, which we could sell to raise money. This was an insult. Of course, we appreciated Duke Ellington, but we were against the administration trying to pass off his birthday concert as monetarily significant. Tacky out the wazoo. We will not help you raise a few nickels for your dead Negro husband, but this other Negro came and visited us. Here, we'll give you a little recording. You can go out and see if you can get a few pennies for that. As tacky as can be. And I don't really hear any bitterness there either, but I'm super glad that she shared both of those anecdotes because I had not heard either of those before. Let's see, what else did I have? I got that. I did not know. I've seen, if you've been to the King Center, they have the reflecting pool and the casket for Dr. King. They have all that set up. I did not know that some of that was connected to, she says, seeing how the community center made a difference was thrilling to me. And the natatorium, that was a new word I had to look up. The Olympic-sized swimming pool connected by a walkway to the community center was used by many local swim teams and also attracted national swim meets. It was one of the nicest pools in Atlanta, which also made me happy. One reason I wanted that pool was because in Marion, Alabama, where I grew up, we were not allowed to swim in the public pools, which were for whites only, and as a child I almost drowned trying to learn to swim in a pond which looked like a big dark hole to me. I was afraid to get in that pond in the first place, and after I did, I never learned to swim. I wanted the next generation to have a different experience. I'm going to stop. Oh, she goes on to talk about tennis too. I was going to say Richard Williams. I don't know how many times this came up when that whole McKinney incident happened in 2015. And Vincent Harding passed in 2014. I meant to say that he was a part that year where lots of black people passed. Ruby Dee, who I think is in that documentary, Montgomery to Memphis, that was mentioned earlier. Vincent Harding, Maya Angelou, Yuri Kochiyama, a lot of black people. Amiri Baraka, who will probably be mentioned in this book. All those folks passed in 2014 with Vincent Harding. But yeah, I thought the swimming pool, that has come up so many times. The McKinney incident, that was 2015, where the little black girl who was manhandled, brutalized by Eric Casebolt, this former enforcement official in McKinney, Texas, talked about the long history of white terrorism targeting black people at swimming sites worldwide. We've talked about that on a litany of books. You can now add this one to the list. It comes up so many. If anything, and I think this even came up last summer when if I can remember the name, Simone Manuel, the black female swimmer at the Olympics. She won the gold medal. I think that was like the first black female to win a medal for swimming. And they said, again, the legacy of black people not being allowed to swim If anything, that should show how much of an impact that this has had on, gotta be like millions of black people to keep hearing this over and over and over and over. I almost died. Or even Richard Williams, he talked about the number of black children who died he was in Louisiana, she was in Alabama, who died because they couldn't go swimming and no lifeguards. You just go out and jump, in the gutter, the ditch, whatever it is. And he said tons of black children. That was a summer ritual. How many black children died because whites won't allow us to use their swimming pool? And I remember one of the white authors that we had on this program, he talked about in Louisiana, they bombed the swimming pool as opposed to allowing the niggers to join them. Last few things I'll get in. I got the impression kind of down the stretch in this chapter that this was sounding more just like a roll call. Like the first chunk of the book I felt like was a lot of really gripping narrative and talking about all these events and things that happened and important historical events and how all of this evolved and what her thoughts were about this and behind the scenes. Now it just seems like a roll call of, all of these important people, many white people, but even a lot of black people who came to the King Center. That is substantially less significant to me. I think racists try to do that sort of thing, I think, to make us think that racism, white supremacy has been lessened, or somehow we're working against racism, where you can get some things to brag about, people that you met, or things that you have, things that you can kind of show off about, really, but it's really not substantially solving the problem, racism, white supremacy, and, what her husband gave his life to fighting against. I think I can end there. It did seem a little rhetoric-y as well. Rhetorical ethic, that was what I was going to say. A lot of this seems very much like rhetorical ethic. That's Dr. Marimba Ani's term, where she talks about how the victims of white supremacy, black people, we end up hearing white people's ideals for brotherhood, the beloved community, all of that. And that's what we should be striving for. She says it in here repeatedly about, striving for democratic ideals. We hear the malarkey that racists say, yes, we're going to strive for that. We want Christian brotherhood. They're not interested in that at all. Individuals who classify themselves as white, they're interested in dominating Negroes forever. And they will just say all of these cute things to keep us fooled, and then they wink and just go about their business, continuing to, orchestrate assassinations, murders, white terrorism. Did anybody have a quick comment they need to get in before we conclude, or folks satisfied? Going last time? Anything? Or everybody satisfied?
Yes. I want to point out, like you said, it seems to be a pattern that anytime there's a structure or something to commemorate a person of great accomplishment, non-white or black, that they seem to allow that particular area to go into aggregation, or, let it run itself down, because the same thing at Frederick Douglass House, and I think that what happens after it gets to a certain point, then they come in with the revitalization or the gentrification, and then it turns all the way around. It's not really majority black after that particular time. So, and you could probably name other places around this part of the planet, where the same thing is going on. I'll mute my line.
Absolutely. I'll be interested if we have folks next week. We'll wrap there, but next week or any of the subsequent weeks, if we have people who've been to the King Center, if we have Atlanta listeners, if you've been to the King Center more recent, like within the last year, let us know what your experience is of the center, the environment around it. Let us know. But I'll put it this way. If you've been to Atlanta, the area where the King Center is and Auburn Avenue that it's on, it does not look like Buckhead at all. Anyone who is familiar with Atlanta, if you want to pick out a nice, sparkly, shiny spot of Atlanta, the Buckhead area where Lenox Mall is and all of that, where it just looks regal and elegant, clean and sparkly. That is not what the area where the King Center looks like at all. And unless things change wow, it would almost it would put like the home makeover shows to shame. It would have to be radically different for that area to look like Buckhead now. And I'll wrap there. We'll be here tomorrow for the compensatory call in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. We'll review news, events last 7 days. Folks have counter-racist suggestions, thoughts. Looking forward to it. We also have a reschedule. We were supposed to be on Tuesday of this week. Dr. Howard Stevenson rescheduled for this coming Tuesday, May 9. So just stay tuned. Normal broadcast time, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. I hope it was a constructive investment of your Friday evening. We'll be back in about 24 hours. I will again encourage folks, enjoy the springtime. Warm weather is grand. You do not want to lax in your codification. Sobriety would be best under conditions of white supremacy. I've seen no evidence that us being intoxicated is going to help us solve the problem, white people. If anything, it makes it way easier for the Eric Casebolts, Daniel Holtz-Claws, any other race soldiers. It makes it way easier for them to terrorize and abuse us. If you're going to be out and about, especially if you got to go out late, which I do not encourage, but if you got to go out, you do not want to be under the influence behind the wheel. You never know when you might be stopped by a race soldier. Your life could be on the line. And that is race soldier badge or no. Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people, victims of white supremacy. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every time we are in contact with another black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Cal signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed.
I'm a victim, brother.
Problem. You're a victim.
I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.